A 6-year-old girl just handed a $2 bill to the most dangerous man in the Mojave Desert, and he took it. Not because he needed the money, because he recognized something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in 20 years of riding through darkness, the complete absence of fear. What happens next will change everything for a mother on the run, a brotherhood with nothing left to lose, and a man who thought his heart had burned out somewhere along Route 66. This is the story of the Desert Iron Riders, and the little girl who made them remember why they started protecting people in the first place. Stay until the end, because nothing about this story goes where you think it's going. And if this hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's ride. The gas station had no name anymore. Whatever sign had once announced it to travelers crawling through the Mojave had long since been stripped by wind or theft or the particular indifference the desert shows to anything built by human hands. What remained was a sun-bleached concrete island, 2 ancient pumps that hadn't dispensed fuel in something approaching a decade, a cinder block structure with a single window painted over in chalky white, and a rusted overhang that provided shade without providing comfort. The overhang creaked in the dry July heat, like a man shifting his weight on bad knees. Abigail Mercer had pulled in 40 minutes ago because the temperature gauge on her 2009 Honda Civic had crawled into the red zone, and because she'd been driving for 11 hours, and because her daughter was crying from the back seat in the quiet way that was somehow worse than screaming, that compressed internal kind of crying where a child has already learned that making too much noise draws the wrong attention. She'd turned off the engine and sat behind the wheel and stared at the painted-over window until she stopped seeing it. $43.70. That was what she had. She'd checked 3 times because her brain kept insisting that if she counted again, the number would change. It didn't change. $43.70 in a wallet that had once carried the kind of credit cards that felt solid when you held them, and a debit card connected to an account that Marcus Vane's attorney had found a way to freeze 2 weeks ago through a civil lien she still didn't fully understand. The attorney had called it a precautionary measure pending resolution of the dispute. What it meant was that every dollar she'd saved across 6 years of working double shifts at the county assessor's office was locked behind a legal wall. She had no money to climb. $43.70 wouldn't get her to San Diego. It wouldn't get her to Barstow. It might get her halfway to the next town if the gauge cooperated, which it showed no signs of doing. In the back seat, Maisie had stopped crying. She was holding her stuffed rabbit, the worn, gray, one-eared thing she'd named Captain, against her chest and watching the desert through the window with the focused solemnity of someone who understood that the landscape matched their situation perfectly. Maisie was 6. She was too young to understand civil liens and too old to pretend that running from your house in the middle of the night was normal. Abigail got out of the car because sitting still had become physically painful. The heat hit her like a hand pressed flat against her face. Dry, absolute, unapologetic. She walked to the front of the car and opened the hood and looked at the engine the way people with no mechanical knowledge look at engines, searching for something obviously, visibly wrong, knowing she wouldn't recognize it if she found it. Steam had stopped rising. That seemed either good or very bad. She heard the cinder block door open behind her. The man who came out was old in the way that desert places produced old men, hollowed and dried and somehow still standing when younger things had given up. He wore a denim shirt with the sleeves cut at the shoulders and held a bottle of water so cold it was sweating in the heat. He looked at her car. He looked at her. He held out the water. "Engine's hot," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Need to let it sit." He looked at the horizon. The way people who'd lived near highways their whole lives looked at horizons, reading something in it she couldn't see. "You staying or going?" "Going," she said. Then, "when the engine cools." "Where to?" She didn't answer that. She'd learned in the past 2 weeks not to answer that. He nodded as if she'd said something perfectly reasonable and went back inside without offering anything else. Through the painted-over window, she could see the ghost of light from a television set. The door closed. She stood in the heat and looked at the engine and tried to construct a plan from $43.70 and a cooling car and a child in the back seat holding a one-eared rabbit, and she couldn't do it. Every angle she tried led to the same wall. She needed money. She had no way to access money. The only people who might wire her money were her sister in Phoenix, who hadn't answered her phone in 3 days, and her mother, who had sided with the story Marcus Vane's people had put in front of her, which was that Abigail was having a breakdown, which was that the bruises she'd shown the Palmdale police officer 2 weeks ago had been explained, to that officer's apparent satisfaction, as the result of a fall down exterior stairs, which was that the emergency protective order she'd filed had been reviewed and dismissed because Marcus Vane had 4 attorneys and she had none, and because Marcus Vane had donated $40,000 to the county sheriff's department's equipment fund the previous year, and because the Palmdale court system processed roughly 200 protective order applications per month, and the woman sitting across the desk from Abigail had been working that desk for 9 years and had stopped seeing the difference between the ones that mattered and the ones that didn't. She went back to the car and opened the rear door and sat sideways in the back seat next to Maisie. Maisie looked at her, not at Captain, not at the window, at her. "Are we okay?" Maisie asked. Abigail put her arm around her daughter and pulled her close and looked at the painted-over window of the cinder-block building and the old man's television ghost and the rusted overhang in the sky, which was so blue it was almost aggressive. "We're going to be okay," she said. She'd been saying that for 2 weeks. She'd said it so many times that the words had developed a hollow sound, like something tapped and found to be empty inside. She said it again anyway, because the alternative was silence, and silence in that particular moment felt like giving up. That was when she heard them. It started as a vibration she felt in the seat before she heard it with her ears, a low-frequency hum that her body registered as a threat before her conscious mind caught up. Then it resolved into sound. The deep, layered, unmistakable thunder of multiple motorcycle engines traveling at highway speed, decelerating. The sound grew until it filled the entire landscape, bouncing off the desert floor and the distant rock formations, rolling over the dead pumps and the cracked concrete and the rusted overhang, and then it stopped. 15 motorcycles rolled into the station in a loose formation that somehow managed to be both casual and geometrically precise, and came to a rest in a line that wrapped around the far side of the concrete island like a closing hand. Abigail's arm tightened around Maisie. The bikers killed their engines one by one, and each silence where an engine had been felt like a held breath. Boots hit pavement. Leather settled. The smell of exhaust and road dust and something metallic drifted through the open car door. They were large men, most of them. Not large in the manufactured way of gyms and protein supplements, but large in the way of men who'd spent years doing physical work and absorbing physical damage and were still standing because stopping wasn't a concept they'd entertained. They wore leather cuts, vests, she would learn later, over dark shirts, and the cuts bore a patch she couldn't read from the car. Several had the particular posture of men who'd spent time in the military, a kind of alert stillness, a way of occupying space that communicated complete awareness of everything in their immediate perimeter without appearing to look at any of it. She wanted to close the car door. She didn't move. One of them walked toward the cinder block building, not the largest, but the one the others seemed to orient around without appearing to do so, the way iron filings orient around a magnet without any visible signal passing between them. He walked with a slight hitch in his right leg, controlled but present, as if he'd made a decision long ago that the leg was going to do what he needed it to do and had simply not renegotiated that agreement. He was somewhere past 40. His face was the kind of face that had been weathered rather than aged. The distinction being that weathering produces texture and character, where age alone just produces lines. His hair was dark with gray at the temples and wore the permanent compression of a helmet carried for years. The beard was several days past deliberate, but not yet arrived at neglect. He knocked on the cinder block door with 2 knuckles. The old man opened it. "Fuel pump working?" the biker asked. "Hasn't worked since 2011, the old man said. "But I got cold water and gas cans in the back, if that helps." Gas cans. 6 of them. 20 gallons total. $1.50 a gallon over pump price for the inconvenience. The biker looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll take all 6. She watched from the car. Maisie had stopped breathing in that way children do when they're processing something they haven't decided how to feel about yet. 2 of the bikers moved to the back of the building with the old man. The others spread out in the practiced, unhurried way of people accustomed to long stops on the road. Some sitting on their bikes, some standing, one sitting cross-legged on the concrete checking something on his phone, one walking the perimeter of the property with his hands in his pockets, looking at the horizon with the same expressionless attention the old man had shown. The man who'd spoken to the old man was now standing near the front of his motorcycle, looking at a paper map. People who carried paper maps, in Abigail's experience, were either very old or very particular, and he wasn't old. He'd spread the map on the seat of the motorcycle and was studying it with his thumb, tracing a route she couldn't see. Maisie was watching him. This was the thing about Maisie that had always slightly unnerved Abigail, not in a frightening way, but in the way that children who see things clearly are sometimes unnerving to adults who've learned to stop doing that. Maisie watched people the way you watch weather, with complete attention, without judgment, as if she was gathering information rather than forming opinions. "Mama," Maisie said quietly. "Yes." "He's sad." Abigail looked at the man with the map. She couldn't see sadness from this distance. She saw competence. She saw control. She saw a man who knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going and had a plan for the territory in between. "How can you tell?" she asked, because asking Maisie questions like this was something she'd learned to do instead of dismissing them. "His shoulders," Maisie said. "They're tired, not like sleep tired, like the other kind." Abigail looked at his shoulders, and she saw it. The thing Maisie had named before she could. The way they carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The way they'd settled into that weight as if they'd given up negotiating with it and simply decided to carry it as a permanent condition. She'd seen that before. In the mirror lately. She looked away. 20 minutes passed. The old man and the two bikers brought out the gas cans, and the transaction was completed in a brief, efficient exchange she couldn't hear from the car. The man with the map had folded it away. He was drinking water from a bottle, leaning against his bike, looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was looking at everything. His gaze moved across the concrete island and paused at the Honda. Not a threatening pause, just a noting, the way you note something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of everything else. He looked away. Another 10 minutes. The heat was doing what Mojave heat did in July. It wasn't performing cruelty, it was simply being itself, which was cruel enough. Abigail's water bottle had been empty for 2 hours. Maisie hadn't complained about being thirsty, which was somehow more worrying than if she had. "I need to get us some water," Abigail said. She reached for her wallet and felt the $43.70 and got out of the car. She was halfway across the concrete when she realized she'd been wrong about the man with the map not watching. He'd been watching in the particular unfocused way of someone who hadn't decided yet whether what they were watching required action. She felt his attention like a change in air pressure. Not aggressive, just present. She went into the cinder block building. The old man charged her $3 for 2 small bottles of water, which was highway robbery in the literal geographic sense, and she paid it because she didn't have a choice, and the math became $40.70, and the wall she couldn't climb got slightly taller. She came back out into the heat and distributed the water, 1 bottle to Maisie, 1 for herself, and leaned against the car and drank and watched the desert and tried not to do the math again. She did the math again. It came out the same. She heard boots on concrete, a distinctive sound, heavier and more deliberate than sneakers or work shoes, and looked up to find one of the younger bikers, not the man with the map, standing several feet away. He had a tattoo on his neck that she couldn't read without staring, and he was holding a package of crackers from some stash she couldn't see. He held them out toward her car. "Kid hungry?" he said. It wasn't phrased as a question about her or as pity. It was phrased the way you offer something to someone who needs it when you want to make it easy for them to take it. She almost refused. The refusal was automatic. The same reflex that had made her tell the Palmdale social worker she was fine, that had made her tell her mother nothing was wrong, that had made her smile when Marcus Vane's attorney arrived at the courthouse steps and told her, in a voice designed to be heard by no one else, that this was her last chance to make a decision that would go well for her. The reflex that said accepting anything from anyone created a debt, and she was done with debts. She shut the reflex down because Maisie hadn't eaten since morning, and the crackers were crackers, and the boy wasn't asking for anything. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and walked away without another word. She handed the crackers through the window to Maisie, who received them with the gravity of someone accepting something important, and opened the package with careful hands and began eating them one by one with the focused attention of a child who'd learned today that food was not guaranteed. That detail hit Abigail somewhere she'd been trying to keep armored and found the armor wasn't as solid as she'd thought. She turned away from the window and looked at the desert because looking at the desert was easier than looking at her daughter eating crackers as if they were something precious. She heard the boots again, closer this time. When she turned, the man with the map was standing about 6 feet away, at a polite distance, a thought-out distance, not a casual one. He had the water bottle in his left hand and a gas can in his right, and he set the gas can down on the concrete between them. "Engine's hot," he said. Same words the old man had used, different weight behind them. "Yes," she said. "How long has it been running like that?" She considered lying, then decided the question didn't contain any threat worth lying to avoid. "About 100 miles. Maybe more." The gauge went up around Victorville. He looked at the car. He walked around to the front without touching anything, looked at the engine with the hood still up, walked back. "Water pump's probably going," he said. "Seen that on those Civics? You run it far, it'll seize." "I know." He looked at her in a way that didn't feel like assessment exactly, but wasn't quite neutral either. It was the look of someone deciding how much to say. "Where are you headed?" She'd told herself she wasn't going to answer that question. She'd answered the old man's version of it with silence, and that had been the correct answer. But there was something about the way this man asked it, something that didn't have need in it, or curiosity in the hunting sense, that made the standard refusal feel like the wrong response. Not for his benefit, for hers. "South," she said. "Enough south." He accepted this as if it were a complete answer, which she supposed it was. "You got fuel?" he asked. "I have $40, she said, and then immediately regretted saying it, because she hadn't meant to say the specific number, but the heat and the exhaustion and the 43 going on $40 and the crackers in her daughter's face had apparently dismantled some of the controls she normally kept functional. He didn't react to the number. He looked at the gas can he'd set on the concrete. "That's got about 3 gallons, he said. "Won't cost you $40. "I don't want... It's old stock from the cans we bought," he said. "It's already paid for. Putting it in the bikes would just be extra weight." He looked at her steadily. "It'll get your engine cooler too, if you let it sit another 30 minutes before you run it." She wanted to say no. She knew that was the right answer, the careful answer, the answer that didn't create obligations. She'd spent 2 weeks learning that accepting help created exposure, and exposure was dangerous, and dangerous things had real consequences. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "Graves Maddox." He didn't extend a hand. He just gave the name the way you give a name when you want someone to have it, without forcing anything more formal around it. She hesitated. "Abigail." He picked up the gas can. "You want to open the tank?" She opened the tank. He filled it without ceremony, without performance, without the particular energy of someone doing something they expected to be thanked for. He simply filled it, replaced the cap on the can, and set the can aside. 30 minutes, he said. "Don't start it before that." "Okay." He walked back toward his bike. She watched him go and tried to construct a reason to feel threatened by what had just happened and couldn't find one, which almost made it more confusing than if she could have. She was accustomed to people who wanted things from her. She knew how to navigate the geometry of need and leverage. She didn't know what to do with simple. She got back in the car. "What did the man say?" Maisie asked. She'd finished the crackers and was holding Captain against her chest again. "He said we need to wait 30 minutes before we drive." Maisie looked toward where Graves Maddox was now sitting on his motorcycle, drinking from his water bottle, looking at the horizon. "Can I go ask him something?" Maisie said. "No. I just want to..." "Maisie." Her daughter was quiet for 2 seconds. Abigail had long ago learned that Maisie's silences were not the same as compliance. They were more often organizational, a period during which Maisie sorted through available information and decided on a new approach. "I want to thank him," Maisie said, "for the gas." "I already thanked him." "I didn't." This was the thing about Maisie that she loved, and that also, in moments like this, made the back of her teeth ache. The absolute sincerity of the child's social instincts. The genuine belief that every kindness deserved its own acknowledgement. The inability to understand why you would take something from someone and not let them see you receiving it. Before she could say anything else, Maisie had slipped out of the back seat on the far side and was walking across the concrete toward the line of motorcycles. Abigail got out of the car. Maisie? But Maisie had already arrived. Graves. Maddox looked down at the child who'd appeared at his left knee with the specific controlled attention of a man who had trained himself not to be startled by unexpected things. He said nothing. He waited. "Thank you for the gas," Maisie said. She was looking up at him with the undivided focus she gave to things she'd decided were important. "We really needed it." He looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a flinch, not quite softening. More like a frequency shift, as if she'd said something in a register that bypassed whatever he normally had screening incoming information. "It's okay," he said. Maisie reached into the pocket of her shorts. She withdrew a folded bill with the carefulness of someone handling an object of significant personal value, and she held it out to him. "I want to give you this," she said. "It's all I have, but it's lucky." Graves Maddox looked at the bill. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it for a moment that stretched just slightly past ordinary, and then he took it from her hand with 2 fingers. Gently, the way you take something from a child when you understand that what you're receiving is more than the object itself. He unfolded it. A $2 bill. Old, worn, soft at the creases, clearly handled often. "Where'd you get this?" he said. "My grandpa," Maisie said. "He said $2 bills are magic because most people never see them, so when you find one, you're already lucky. He gave it to me before he died." Graves Maddox was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved across the surface of the bill once, twice, in a gesture that seemed more reflexive than deliberate. "I can't take this," he said. But he hadn't folded it back and offered it to her. He was still holding it. "I want you to have it," Maisie said, "because you were nice to us. My grandpa said lucky things work better when you give them to someone who needs luck more than you." Abigail had stopped moving 3 feet behind her daughter. She was watching Graves Maddox's face. She had no framework for what she was seeing there. It was too complex, too layered with things that had been compressed for too long to surface cleanly. But she saw it. The way the bill in his hand meant something it had no business meaning to a stranger. The way Maisie's words had found a room in him that he'd apparently had bricked over and apparently hadn't been entirely successful. He folded the bill carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his vest. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, flat and direct, and somehow carrying everything that wasn't in them. "You're welcome," Maisie said, with the complete social satisfaction of someone who had accomplished what they set out to do. She turned around and walked back to the car. Abigail followed her and did not look back because looking back felt like it would change something she wasn't ready to have changed. 28 minutes later, she started the engine. The gauge behaved. She backed out carefully, pulled onto the desert highway going south, and watched the motorcycle club get smaller in the rearview mirror until the road curved and the desert swallowed them whole. She didn't let herself think about Graves Maddox or the $2 bill or the look on his face when a 6-year-old handed him something she'd been carrying since her grandfather died. She didn't let herself think about any of it because she had enough things to carry already and because the thinking would crack something she needed to keep intact. She drove. Maisie slept in the back seat with Captain pressed against her cheek. The desert did what deserts do, which is continue. Flat and absolute and indifferent, interrupted occasionally by a rock formation or a distant water tower or a billboard for something nobody in the vicinity needed. The temperature gauge stayed in the normal range. The engine sounded fine. The $40 would get her to a motel. Not a good motel, not a safe-feeling motel, but a motel, which was currently the entirety of the plan. What she didn't know was that 40 miles behind her, 15 motorcycles were pulling back onto the highway going south, and the man leading them had his right hand over his left chest, over the inside pocket of his vest, for just a moment before he put it back on the throttle. What she didn't know was that 2 of the bikers had been on their phones while she drove away. Not idle phone use, but the particular economical use of men who made calls to get information rather than to talk. What she didn't know was that her name had traveled through channels she didn't know existed, from the Mojave to Palmdale to a man named Harlan Birch, who worked for Marcus Vane's security operation, who had received an alert 3 hours ago from the tracking app that Marcus had installed on the phone she no longer had. The phone she'd left on the kitchen counter when she left because she'd read enough to know that the phone was a leash, and who was currently driving north from San Bernardino, trying to pick up her trail. She drove south through the cooling desert afternoon, not knowing any of this, believing she was finally ahead of the thing chasing her. The motel she found outside Victorville was called the Sundowner Inn, which was either poetic or ironic depending on how you felt about sunset imagery. The neon sign worked except for the D in Sundowner, which made it the Sunowner Inn, and the parking lot had 4 cars in it and a vending machine with a crack running through the upper right corner of its plastic front. She paid cash. The man at the desk, middle-aged, neck tattoo of a different variety than the young bikers, the permanent red-eyed look of someone who'd stopped sleeping in a natural pattern, took the cash and gave her a key card and didn't look at Maisie. The room was a double bed and a cot and a television bolted to the dresser and a bathroom with a shower that produced water in 2 temperatures, scalding and cold, and curtains that almost closed. The carpet was the color of something that had once been beige. The air conditioning unit made a sound like a man clearing his throat every 45 seconds, regular as a metronome. Maisie explored the room with the focused attention she brought to new spaces, checking the closet, looking under the bed, testing the lock on the bathroom door. This was a habit she'd developed in the past 2 weeks, and it broke Abigail's heart every time she watched it, because it was such an obviously pragmatic adaptation for a 6-year-old to have made. "It's okay," Maisie reported. "No one's hiding." "Good," Abigail said. "That's good, baby." She fed Maisie from the vending machine down the hall. Crackers again, because the options were crackers, chips, or candy, and crackers felt like the closest to food, and let her watch cartoons until she fell asleep, and then sat in the dark with the curtains pulled and the air conditioning clearing its throat and listened to the parking lot. Nothing. Cars on the highway, distant and regular. The vending machine's electrical hum. A door somewhere down the row opening and closing. She should sleep. She hadn't slept more than 3 hours in any one stretch since she'd left Palmdale, and the lack of it was doing things to her perception, thickening things, making edges less sharp, producing a state that wasn't quite anxiety and wasn't quite calm but was something stretched between the two. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the curtain gap and didn't sleep. At some point past midnight, headlights swept across the curtains. She went still. The lights tracked across, continued, moved away. A car pulling through, not stopping. She exhaled. She finally dozed in the chair around 2 a.m, the kind of not-quite sleep where your body rests but your ears stay operational, cataloging sounds and running risk assessments on each one. She was still in that not-quite sleep when, at a little past 3, a sound registered that her body had apparently classified as requiring immediate attention before her conscious mind had a chance to evaluate it. Footsteps. Outside the door. Not passing by footsteps, the slow, stopping kind. She was out of the chair before she was fully awake. The knock on the door was not loud. It was the particular kind of knock that was designed to wake someone without being heard 2 rooms away. She stood beside the door, not in front of it. "Who is it?" she said. Flat. Not a question so much as a test. Silence on the other side, and then, "Birch. Marcus Vane sent me. Ms. Mercer, I need you to open the door." The name Birch hit her like cold water. She knew that name. Harlan Birch had been at 2 of the meetings Marcus's attorneys had scheduled, the ones framed as mediation, the ones where she'd sat across from men in expensive suits while they explained patiently and with complete control of their faces how much easier everything would be if she simply stopped. Birch had never spoken in those meetings. He'd sat to one side and watched her in the way security people watch things, cataloging, weighing, deciding. "I'm not opening the door," she said. "Ms. Mercer." A pause that felt calculated. "You can make this easier or harder. That's the only choice left." Maisie was awake. Abigail could see it in the dark. The stillness that replaced sleeping stillness, the way her daughter had gone rigid under the blanket, Captain held against her chest. Maisie didn't make a sound. The knock came again. Abigail? Not Ms. Mercer now. The use of her first name in Birch's mouth was not familiarity. It was a threat wearing the clothes of familiarity. We know what you think you have. We know what you're planning. There is no version of this that ends well for you without his cooperation. She was looking at the door. She was counting things. The distance to the window, the locks on the door. 2. A knob lock and a chain. The distance between the window and the parking lot. The height from the window ledge to the ground. Whether Maisie could be moved quietly and quickly through a window in the dark. I'm calling the police, she said, and reached for her phone, and remembered that her phone was a new prepaid burner and that she'd called exactly one person on it. Her sister, who hadn't answered, and that the battery was at 11%. The desk clerk is a friend of Mr. Vane's, Birch said conversationally. He let us know when you checked in. She stared at the door. The clerk with the red eyes and the neck tattoo who'd taken her cash and handed her the key card and not looked at Maisie. She looked at her daughter in the dark, and Maisie was looking back at her with the absolute trust of a child who has decided that her mother knows what to do. And Abigail did not know what to do. The chain lock was rattling now, not being forced, being worked slowly, deliberately, by something thin slipped through the door gap, a card or a tool or something she couldn't see in the dark. The knob lock was already compromised. She hadn't heard that, which meant she'd been sleeping harder than she thought at some point, which meant the chain gave. The door opened 4 inches. In the 4 inches, she could see part of a face, an eye, professional, patient. Don't make this... The rest of the sentence did not arrive because the parking lot outside suddenly filled with sound. Not cars, not the highway, engines, deep, layered, identical in register to the sound she'd felt in her seat at the abandoned gas station 8 hours ago. The sound built in the way a tide builds. You hear it before you see it, and what you hear first is the edge of something enormous. The eye in the door gap disappeared. Birch's voice stopped mid-sentence. Through the gap in the curtain, Abigail saw the first headlight appear at the entrance to the Sundowner Inn parking lot. Then another. Then more. Until the parking lot was washed in the white light of 15 motorcycles rolling in formation into the space where her car was, where Birch's car was, where the cracked vending machine stood sentinel in the yellow sodium light. The engines died, one by one. The silence after was not like before the engine's silence. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that has weight. The door, 4 inches ajar, did not open further. Abigail moved to the window and pulled the curtain back 2 inches and looked out at the parking lot. In the center of the formation, lit by the ambient light of all those now dead headlights reflecting off the asphalt, stood Graves Maddox. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at Birch, who had stepped back from it and was standing near the front of a dark sedan, and whatever expression was on Graves's face in the low light was not one that invited negotiation. His left hand moved to the inside pocket of his vest. He took out the $2 bill. He held it for just a moment, and then he put it back. And then he started walking toward Harlan Birch, and the 14 men behind him began moving in the same direction with the quiet coherence of people who had rehearsed this. Harlan Birch was not a man who frightened easily. This was something he would have told you himself, and it would have been true in the narrow, professional sense. He'd spent 11 years doing work for people who needed problems made quiet, and quiet problems required a specific kind of temperament, a detachment from ordinary human nervousness that most people couldn't manufacture, and he'd simply been born with. He didn't sweat at the wrong moments. He didn't talk when silence was more useful. He'd stood in rooms with men who were considering very unpleasant options and hadn't flinched, because flinching invited escalation, and he understood the geometry of that. But standing in the parking lot of the Sundowner Inn at 3:17 in the morning with 15 motorcycle engines ticking down from heat in a loose perimeter around him, Harlan Birch was doing a rapid and uncomfortable reevaluation of the landscape. It wasn't the numbers. He'd handled numbers before. It was the silence. Men who want to frighten you make noise. They announce themselves. They give you the performance of threat because the performance is usually enough, and they know it, and they've learned to lead with it. These men had turned off their engines and stepped off their bikes and moved into position with a quiet that was more disturbing than any amount of noise, because quiet like that meant they weren't performing. They'd already made their decisions. They were past the part of the evening that required communication. Graves Maddox stopped 8 feet from him. He looked at Birch the way you look at a problem you've already solved and are now just waiting to formally close. "You work for Vane," Graves said. Birch didn't confirm or deny. His hands were at his sides, and he was very carefully not looking at the other men, because looking at them would be an acknowledgement that they were the relevant factor, and acknowledging that would cost him the only leverage he had, which was the appearance of someone who wasn't measuring exits. "This is a private matter," Birch said, "between Mr. Vane and—" "No," Graves said. One word, not loud. Arrived with the finality of something physical. Birch looked at him. Graves was looking back without performance. No theater of intimidation, no chest-forward posturing. Just a man standing in the parking lot with his hands loose at his sides, and the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who've decided that what they're looking at requires handling. "The woman and the kid," Graves said. "They under your employer's protection? I'm not at liberty to—" "Yes or no?" A pause. "Mr. Vane has legal interests in—" "Yes or no?" The second repetition was quieter than the first. That was the wrong direction for that kind of repetition to go, and Birch understood immediately that it was the wrong direction, and that the space behind his breastbone that usually stayed regulated was not staying regulated. "No," Birch said. "Then we're done talking about Marcus Vane," Graves said. He took a step to the right, not toward Birch, around him, toward the motel door. "You're going to get in your car. You're going to drive north. And you're going to tell your employer that the situation in Victorville has developed some complications." Birch turned very carefully, tracking the movement. "You don't know who you're inserting yourself with," he said. Graves stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. The look was not angry. It was something much flatter than anger, much less interested in being understood. "I spent 2 tours in Fallujah," Graves said. "I know exactly what I'm inserting myself with." He went to the motel room door and knocked twice with 2 knuckles, a deliberate echo of the same knock he'd used on the cinder block building at the dead gas station 8 hours ago. Behind Abigail, Maisie had stopped breathing the held breath way again. Abigail stood 6 inches from the door and did not move. "It's Graves Maddox," he said from the other side. "The gas station." She stood there another 4 seconds, long enough to feel the absurdity of the situation, the door between her and a man she didn't know. The man she didn't know standing between her and a problem she absolutely knew. The problem she absolutely knew currently being watched by 14 other men she didn't know. The geometry of it was insane. She was running the geometry in real time and every angle was insane. She opened the door. He was exactly as she remembered, minus the paper map, and plus the context of 3 in the morning in a bad parking lot, which changed the texture of everything without changing the underlying facts. He looked at her for a moment, checking something she couldn't name. "You hurt?" he asked. "No." "The kid?" "She's fine. She stopped. Maisie had appeared at her side, captain under one arm, looking up at Graves Maddox with the recognition of someone encountering a previously filed reference. "Hi," Maisie said. "Hey," he said. Then to Abigail, "We need to talk." She stepped back from the door, because what else was there to do? And he came in, and she closed the door. And in the parking lot outside, through the gap in the curtain, she watched Birch's sedan back carefully out of the space it occupied and move toward the parking lot exit with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who understood the performance required of him. The sedan turned north. She let the curtain fall. Graves Maddox was standing in the middle of the motel room looking at the space with the practiced sweep of someone inventorying a location. Exits, lines of sight, the window and the bathroom door, and the distance between the beds and the front door. She watched him do it and recognized it as something other than paranoia. It was maintenance. The way people who'd spent time in certain situations maintained a certain relationship to rooms. "Sit down," he said. It came out more like a directive than an invitation, and she felt the reflexive pushback that directives produced in her these days. The automatic resistance to being told what to do that had developed as a survival mechanism over the past 2 years. "This is my room," she said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not apology, but adjustment. "You want to sit down," he said. "It'll be easier." She sat down on the edge of the bed. He remained standing, which she would have read as a power positioning in another context, but in this one felt more like a man who simply didn't think about chairs. "How did you find us?" she said. "Your car," he said. "Partial plate from the gas station. One of my guys ran it." "Ran it," as in, we have people who find things. He said it without elaboration, without apology. It landed as a fact about the world rather than a boast or a threat. She absorbed this. She looked for the word. "That's the same kind of thing that he's been doing, tracking me." "I know." He held her gaze. "But we're not him." "I don't know that," she said. "I don't know you." "No," he said. "You show up twice in one day. You fuel my car, you find my license plate, you show up at 3 a.m. at my motel room." "Yes." "That sounds like something someone who means me harm does." He didn't argue it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode, something in the set of his jaw that was either patience or the practiced stillness of a man who'd learned not to defend himself in situations where defense would be wasted. "The man outside," he said. "Harlan Birch. You know him." "Yes." "He's done this before? Found you?" She thought about 3 weeks ago, the parking garage in Santa Clarita, the elevator doors opening on Birch standing in the fluorescent light holding a manila envelope of photographs. Photographs of herself and Maisie at the park, at the school, at the grocery store, a week's worth of their ordinary movements documented and presented to her as a question that didn't need to be spoken aloud. She thought about the attorney's office 2 days later. She thought about the protective order that had been dismissed before she'd had a chance to understand why it was being dismissed. "Yes," she said. Graves was quiet for a moment, processing. "Marcus Vane," he said. "Real estate." "You know him." "Know of him. His projects run through the high desert. He's pushed a few people off land they've held for generations, bought county commissioners, the usual." He said the usual with a flatness that indicated familiarity with the category rather than acceptance of it. "What's his specific interest in you?" She looked at her hands. They were folded in her lap in the careful, composed way she'd been maintaining for 2 weeks. The way that said she was holding something together through deliberate attention rather than structural integrity. "My husband died 14 months ago," she said. "Car accident, or they said car accident." She felt Graves go still in a way that was different from his ordinary stillness. "After he died, I was going through the financial files. We'd had the house. A house outside Palmdale, 6 acres, been in Daniel's family. Valuable land, dry and flat enough for development. Vane had been trying to buy it for 2 years before the accident. Daniel kept saying no." She stopped, started again. "I found documents. In the files. Correspondence between Vane's company and someone in the county assessor's office. My office. About the property. About the timeline." She looked up. "About a week before Daniel died." The room was very quiet. The air conditioning unit cleared its throat. Maisie had drifted back to the cot and was lying down with Captain, watching the ceiling, listening with the focused non-participation that children deploy when adults are having conversations they've been told aren't for them. "You kept the documents," Graves said. "Yes." "Where?" "Not here." He looked at her without pressure, just looking. "Safe deposit box," she said. "Barstow. Different name. My maiden name." She paused. "I'm not an idiot." "No," he said. "You're not. I just—" She stopped, breathed. "I went to the police. I went twice. The second time I had copies of the documents. The detective who took my statement, his name was Crenshaw. He was polite. He asked good questions. He took the copies. He told me they'd look into it." She picked at the edge of her thumbnail. 3 days later, I got served with the civil lien. Crenshaw called me that same day to tell me the documents had been reviewed and didn't establish the legal threshold required. Those exact words, like he'd been given them. Graves said nothing. 2 days after that, Birch was in the parking garage. She looked at her hands. I stopped going to the police. Because Crenshaw told Vane you'd been in, Graves said. I think so, yes. Another silence. From outside came the low sound of male voices. Not words, just the presence of voices. His people, in the parking lot, doing whatever they did in parking lots at 3 a.m. when they were waiting. Why are you helping us? She said. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she wondered if he was going to answer at all, or if the question was going to sit there between them until something else replaced it. The kid gave me something, he said. A $2 bill, she said. It's not about the bill, he said. Flat, not dismissive. It's about what she meant when she gave it. He stopped, looked away at the wall. Not evasion, more like distance, as if the thing he was about to say needed to be viewed from far enough away to be sayable. I had a daughter. She'd be 8 now. The room absorbed this. Abigail did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't reduce what he'd just given her. She and her mother, he said. Car accident, 3 years ago. A pause. I was on a second deployment. Nobody called me for 48 hours because nobody could find the right number. By the time I got back, he didn't finish the sentence. The unfinished sentence sat in the air and was its own completion. I'm sorry, Abigail said. He turned back from the wall. I don't need sorry, he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. But I need you to understand why I'm not going to watch another kid lose her surviving parent to a man like Vane. She held his gaze. That's not a business transaction, she said carefully. No. That's personal. Yes. Personal can get complicated, she said. Personal can become about something other than what it started as. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. It can. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He moved toward the door. I'll be outside if you need anything. We'll talk more in the morning about what comes next. I haven't agreed to anything, she said. I know. He opened the door. You don't have to. He stepped out and closed it. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the door close and looked at the curtain and said nothing. From the cot, Maisie said, his daughter's name was probably something pretty. Abigail looked at her daughter. Go to sleep, she said. Okay, Maisie said, and closed her eyes with the immediate trust of someone who had decided things were manageable. Abigail did not close her eyes for a long time. Outside, the low sound of voices continued, punctuated occasionally by the creak of leather or the metallic sound of a lighter. No engines, no raised voices, just presence. The particular kind of presence that functioned less like surveillance and more like a perimeter, something arranged around rather than over. She slept eventually, sideways on the bed in her clothes, and her sleep was dreamless, which was the first time in 2 weeks that had been true. Morning arrived as desert mornings do. Not gradually, but suddenly, the light jumping from absent to overwhelming the way someone throws a switch rather than dims a lamp. She woke to the sound of a motorcycle idling outside her door, and her body moved before her mind did. Upright, hand toward the nightstand where nothing useful was. And then her mind caught up and she heard voices, calm voices, and the motorcycle engine cut, and Maisie was still sleeping on the cot with Captain. She went to the window. The parking lot was different in daylight. Still the bikers, still their machines arranged in the same loose formation, but daylight stripped the cinematic quality from it and revealed it as what it actually was. A group of exhausted men in worn leather sitting on expensive motorcycles eating fast food out of paper bags, passing a coffee thermos, checking phones, existing in the ordinary biological way that all humans existed, regardless of what they were or where they were or what they'd agreed to do. 2 of them were sitting on the asphalt with their backs against their bikes, legs stretched out, looking at something on a laptop they'd balanced on the seat above them. Graves was standing at the far end of the row, drinking coffee from a paper cup and talking to a compact, sharp-featured man she hadn't seen clearly in the dark. The one, she thought, who'd given Maisie the crackers. The conversation looked serious without looking heated, the body language of 2 men who disagreed about something and were managing the disagreement with discipline. She took her time in the bathroom, changed her clothes from the bag she'd had the presence of mind to grab when she left Palmdale, and splashed water on her face until the bathroom mirror produced someone who looked functional, if not rested. She went outside. The morning air still had the desert night in it, cooling fast toward the heat that would arrive in 2 hours, the transition window where the Mojave briefly became almost bearable. A rooster somewhere behind the motel disagreed with the assessment. Graves saw her and walked over. The sharp-featured man watched her approach with the evaluating look she was starting to recognize as standard issue within this group. "This is Cade," Graves said. "Road Sergeant," Cade said. The title seemed to carry its own internal definition. He had gray eyes that moved across her in a quick, functional inventory and then settled into something neutral. "You sleep?" "Some." "Good." He handed her the coffee thermos. "We got food. Nothing great." She took the thermos and poured and drank and felt the coffee hit her system with the particular mercy coffee shows to the seriously exhausted. "We need to talk about your situation," Cade said. "You mean your road captain told you my situation," she said. "He told me what you told him." Cade looked at her without heat. "I'm the guy who decides if what you told him changes our operational picture." "Your operational picture? Where we go, what we do, what kind of exposure we take on." He said it without apology. "We don't go in blind." She looked at Graves. Graves was looking at his coffee. "He vouched for you," Cade said. "I respect that. But he vouches from the gut. I work from the facts." "He told you about his daughter," she said. Cade's expression shifted just slightly, a tightening, then a release. "He told me about the kid at the gas station, giving him the bill." He paused. "I know about his daughter. We all know about his daughter. It's not something we use lightly as a reason to write into something." "I understand," she said. "You think he's acting on emotion." "I think he's acting on something that might overlap with emotion. I think the distinction matters." She looked at the parking lot, the row of men eating fast food, the laptop on the motorcycle seat, the ordinary texture of it. "I have documents," she said, "in a safe deposit box in Barstow. If I can get to them, you'll see what I'm saying it's not a theory. There are emails between Vane's company and a county official that discuss my husband's property, with a timeline that ends 4 days before Daniel died." Cade was quiet, processing. "You think Vane had your husband killed," he said. "I think I have evidence that suggests someone with reason to want my husband dead was in communication with people who could make things happen. I think it got cleaned up very efficiently and very fast." She kept her voice level. "I think Marcus Vane spent $400,000 on the Palmdale area in political contributions in the 18 months before Daniel died. I think property that he couldn't buy through negotiation changed hands through probate at 60% of assessed value because probate courts don't negotiate." She stopped. "I think a lot of things. I have documentation for some of them." The morning was fully bright now and warm at the edges. Cade looked at Graves. Graves looked at his coffee. "Barstow's 40 minutes, Cade said. She hadn't said the word yes yet, but the conversation had evolved past the point where yes was a required formality, and she found she's standing in the parking lot of the Sundowner Inn drinking thermos coffee in the warming desert morning, that she wasn't certain how she felt about that. The drive to Barstow was 2 vehicles, her Honda, followed by 7 of the motorcycles, the other 8 having ridden ahead to positions she wasn't told about and didn't ask about. Graves rode beside her for the first 20 miles and then moved ahead, and she found herself oddly oriented by that, the sound of his motorcycle in front of her, a fixed point in the auditory landscape. Maisie sat in the back seat and watched the desert through the window, with the particular focused contentment of a child who had organized the situation into something understandable. She'd organized it, Abigail suspected, as the nice man from the gas station and his friends are helping us. The simplicity of that was either entirely correct or a substantial reduction, and Abigail wasn't sure which. The bank in Barstow was a regional branch, small lobby, efficient staff, the kind of place that processed more mining company accounts than personal banking. She went in alone, which Graves had accepted without discussion. She used her maiden name and the ID she'd gotten from the DMV 14 months ago during the period when she'd understood, on a cellular level, before her conscious mind caught up, that she might someday need a version of herself that Marcus Vane's people couldn't immediately attach to Abigail Mercer. The safe deposit box contained a manila folder, 3 USB drives, and a photograph of Daniel taken at the property 2 summers ago. Him standing in the afternoon light with his hand on a fence post, squinting into the sun, a half smile on his face like he knew something funny and wasn't ready to share it yet. She pressed the photograph against her chest for exactly 5 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then put it in the folder and took everything to the car. In the parking lot, she handed the folder to Graves. Not Cade. Graves. She wasn't entirely sure why. He opened it. He read the first 2 pages without expression. He turned to the third. Cade, at his shoulder, read it too. The USB drives she left in the box. They were backup, labeled in her handwriting with dates and file names. She digitized everything twice. Once to a drive she'd left with a friend in Sacramento under the guise of a package for safekeeping. Once to a cloud account under a name that had never been associated with Abigail Mercer or Abigail Whitmore or anyone she was or had been. "The name here," Graves said. He tapped the page without pointing specifically. "Aldrin Burke, County Assessor's Office." "My direct supervisor," she said. "For 4 years." He's the one in contact with Vane's company. 14 documented exchanges over 6 months, 7 of them after Marcus Vane made his first formal offer on the property. Graves looked up from the folder. "You worked for this man," he said, "for 4 years. Yes. And you're confident he didn't know you had this?" She thought about Aldrin Burke, the carefully maintained distance he'd kept over the past 14 months, the way he'd stopped eating lunch in the break room when she was there, the way he'd processed her emergency leave after Daniel's accident with an efficiency that had felt then like bureaucratic kindness and felt now like something else entirely. "He knew I was asking questions," she said. "He may have assumed I'd found something. I think—" She stopped, made herself say it. "I think he's the one who told Crenshaw. I think the leak from the police back to Vane came through Burke." Cade made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Graves closed the folder. "We need to talk," he said, and by we, he didn't mean her. He moved to the far side of the parking lot with Cade, and the conversation that followed was low and brief and conducted with their backs to her, which she recognized as consideration rather than exclusion. They were giving her the option of not hearing what was being decided. She stood by her car and watched Maisie in the back seat, who had found a pencil somewhere and was drawing on a gas station receipt with the focused seriousness of a child engaged in important artistic work. The conversation ended. Graves came back. Cade went to his bike and made a call. "We're going to Palmdale," Graves said. "I'm not going back to Palmdale," she said. "You don't have to go anywhere near the property," he said. "But if those documents establish what you're saying they establish, then there are people in Palmdale who need to be sitting across from someone who isn't a cop and isn't a lawyer when certain information is shared with them." "That sounds like intimidation." "It's conversation," he said. "What people do with conversation is their business." She looked at him. "You're going to go talk to Aldrin Burke." "We're going to talk to some people," he said. "Informally." What does informally mean in this context? He held her gaze with the steadiness she was beginning to understand was not performance but structure, the thing that held the rest of him together. It means no one gets hurt. It means information moves. It means people make decisions about what they want the next part of their life to look like. She wanted to say this was insane. She wanted to point out that she'd spent 2 weeks doing everything right, filing proper complaints, using legal channels, being careful, and it had produced a civil lien and Harlan Birch in a parking garage and a door being worked open at 3 in the morning. She wanted to point out that these men were strangers, and she had a 6-year-old daughter, and the sensible thing was to get back in the car and drive somewhere Marcus Vane couldn't reach her and wait for the legal system to eventually, someday, work. She looked at the folder in Graves's hand. She thought about Daniel in that photograph, hand on the fence post, half smile. She thought about the detective Crenshaw saying legal threshold required with the voice of a man reading from a prepared script. "Okay," she said, "but I drive myself. I'm not cargo." "Wasn't suggesting you were." And I need a phone charger. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and produced one without ceremony. Universal. She took it without commenting on the fact that he'd apparently been carrying a phone charger. They rode north. The formation that assembled on the highway outside Barstow was different from the one that had pulled into the Sundowners' parking lot, more organized, with bikes at intervals in a pattern that she suspected served a purpose she didn't fully understand and wasn't going to ask about on a public highway. Her Honda in the center, Graves ahead, 2 bikes behind. She drove and watched his back in her windshield and the desert unrolling alongside, and thought about the folder on the passenger seat and the USB drives she hadn't taken from the box because taking everything at once was bad operational practice, a thing she'd figured out on her own in the 2 weeks of running and hiding, the way you learn things when the cost of not learning them was immediate and specific. Maisie was drawing again. 23 miles out of Barstow, the bike immediately behind her on the right. A lean, dark man named Priest that she'd been introduced to in the parking lot without ceremony, the one who'd been running the laptop on the motorcycle seat, suddenly accelerated, came alongside her window, and held up his fist. The road signal for stop. She braked. Everyone braked. Priest was on his phone, one hand on the bars, his face doing something that she read immediately as a problem. Graves had turned around and come back along the shoulder. He pulled up to her window. "Problem?" she said. "Priest ran the county records on the property," he said. His voice was level, which paradoxically made it worse. The property that was supposed to be in probate for another 6 months pending final assessment. She felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "It already transferred," she said. It wasn't a question. Graves looked at her. 3 days ago. 3 days ago, she'd been in a motel in Lancaster, 2 days after the Palmdale police had made a wellness check at her request and reported back that there was no sign of tampering or threat at the property. Everything appeared normal. Would she like to speak to a family services coordinator? She'd declined the coordinator. She'd called her sister. Her sister hadn't answered. 3 days ago, Marcus Vane had completed the transfer of her dead husband's property. The property that was, according to the civil lien, being held as security against a disputed financial claim she still couldn't find the original basis for. "It's gone," she said. Not to Graves, not to anyone in particular. "Title transferred to a holding company," Priest said from behind Graves. "Cascade Ridge Development Partners, LLC. Registered in Delaware. I need another 40 minutes to trace the principals, but—" "Vane?" she said. "Almost certainly," Priest said. She sat in the car with both hands on the wheel and the engine idling and the desert on both sides and the folder on the passenger seat and the USB drives 30 miles behind her in a safe deposit box and the photograph of Daniel with his hand on the fence post and his half smile. And she felt something that had been holding the shape of hope for 2 weeks give a kind of small internal crack. Graves was watching her from his bike, not saying anything, not rushing toward the next step, just present. "He doesn't just want to get away with it," she said. "He's already gotten away with it. The property is gone." She felt the crack work further along. "He's covering the rest because I have the emails. If the emails go away, the whole thing just becomes a widow who makes accusations and can't prove them." "The emails don't go away," Graves said. "I know that. I know I have them. But they've already done the thing. They took the land. They killed my husband, and they took the land." The crack reached somewhere structural. What does any of this do, now that they've already—" "Abigail." Her name in his mouth, flat and certain. She looked at him. "The documents don't just protect what's already gone," he said. "They put him in a room he can't walk out of." "The police—" "Not the police," Graves said. He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. "We're going to Palmdale, and what we're going to do is significantly more direct than a police report." She understood then that they had crossed a threshold she hadn't been paying attention to crossing. Not a violent one. She believed that, or she believed it, which was close enough. But a threshold past which the ordinary apparatus of legal remedy and institutional recourse was no longer the operating framework. Past which the framework was 15 men who understood how to create consequences, and a folder of evidence, and the name Marcus Vane, and no remaining patience for the slow machinery that had already failed to work. She put the car in drive. "Let's go," she said. Graves watched her for a second, then nodded and turned his bike north. They rode for another 11 miles in the formation that had reorganized itself around the new information, and the desert gave way to the first outer edges of civilization. Gas stations with working pumps, a strip mall, a billboard for a car dealership that had closed 3 years ago. And Abigail was thinking about Aldrin Burke's face, the way he'd looked at her across the assessor's office on the last day she'd worked there, the look that had wanted to be sympathetic and had achieved something closer to relieved. She was thinking about that look when Priest came alongside her window again with his hand raised, and this time his expression was not the problem-processing expression from 20 minutes ago. This time it was something significantly more urgent. He held up his phone toward her window. On the screen, a photo, surveillance quality, grainy in the way of cameras that are meant to exist rather than to capture, of a woman and a child in a parking lot. She recognized the parking lot. The Sundowner Inn. Last night. And she recognized, with a cold that went all the way through her, that the camera angle was from inside the motel. From the lobby, possibly, or from the hallway camera. And that the timestamp in the lower right corner read 3 hours ago, not last night, and that the image had been sent from a number she didn't recognize to Priest's phone via a chain of forwarding that he was already tracing. Someone had sent Vane's people the image 3 hours ago, after Birch had driven away north, after the motorcycles had surrounded the parking lot and the situation had appeared to resolve. 3 hours ago, when she'd been in the Barstow Bank holding a photograph of her dead husband, someone in or near the Sundowner Inn had sent a surveillance image of her and Maisie to a number connected to Marcus Vane's operation, which meant Birch driving away north had not been Birch giving up. It had been Birch making a phone call, which meant that somewhere between the Sundowner Inn and Barstow and the highway they were currently on, someone else was already moving. Graves had seen Priest's face. He pulled alongside the other bike, got the phone shoved in front of him for 2 seconds, handed it back, and came to her window. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. A tightening across the jaw and around the eyes that was the expression of a man rapidly integrating bad information. "Get off this road," he said. "What?" "Next exit. Right now. We need to talk, and we need to not be visible from the air doing it." "From the air," she repeated. "Vane has a helicopter," Graves said, "registered to a charter company he owns. It left the Van Nuys airport 47 minutes ago." The desert was very flat and very wide and offered nothing to hide under, which she understood now was not a coincidence in terms of why this road had been chosen as the problem. She took the next exit. The road off the highway ran into a collection of industrial buildings, self-storage, a vehicle impound lot behind chain link, a long disused grain structure, and she pulled into the gravel lot of the self-storage and killed the engine and sat in the sudden quiet. The motorcycles arranged themselves around the car with the unhurried precision she'd come to read as their resting state, a thing they did not out of performance, but out of habit, out of the deep muscle memory of men who'd spent years in environments where your position relative to a threat was the difference between outcomes. Graves was off his bike before the engine died. He came to her window. "I need you to understand something," he said. His voice was very even. "Tell me." "The man in that helicopter is not going to Palmdale," he said. "He's coming here, or close to here." He looked at the folder on her passenger seat. "If he gets those documents and gets to you before we get to him, I know what happens," she said. "I need to know if you trust us enough," he said, "because what comes next, it's not going to be quiet." She looked at Maisie in the rear-view mirror. Maisie was still drawing on the gas station receipt, or pretending to, with the careful concentration of a child who was listening to every word. She looked at the folder. She thought about the wall she couldn't climb, the detective who'd read from a script, the door being worked open with something thin at 3 a.m, the safe deposit box, and the photograph and the half-smile that had been present in the world 14 months ago and was not present in the world now. She looked at Graves Maddox, who had ridden 40 miles on the basis of a $2 bill and a 6-year-old's assessment of his tired shoulders, and who was standing at her window at 9 a.m. in a gravel lot between a self-storage and a chain-link fence, looking at her with the steadiness of a man who had decided something and was waiting for her to decide the same thing. "I trust you enough," she said. He held her gaze for one more second, nodded once. He turned back to his men and said 4 words she couldn't hear clearly over the distance and the desert wind, and the response was immediate. Engines starting, phones coming out, Cade moving to the front of the formation with the sharp-eyed economy of someone whose entire professional identity was the management of exactly this kind of rapidly evolving situation. She sat in the car and watched them move and felt the last exit ramp in her mind close. There was no version of the next part of this that didn't require going directly toward the thing she'd been running from for 2 weeks, and she could feel the understanding of that settling into her body like a change in pressure, like what you feel when an elevator begins to descend before it has visibly moved. Above the industrial lot, the sky was the aggressive blue of the Mojave at its worst, and somewhere in that blue, 47 minutes out of Van Nuys, a helicopter was turning south toward whatever Marcus Vane had told its pilot to find. And 15 men on motorcycles were already moving to be somewhere between the helicopter and the woman it was looking for, which was either the most inexplicable thing that had ever happened to Abigail Mercer or the most inevitable, and she was no longer certain the difference between those two things mattered as much as it once had. She started her engine. She pulled out of the gravel lot, and somewhere ahead of her, in the direction they were all riding, Harlan Birch, who had not driven north after all, but had simply driven far enough to make a call, was standing in a roadside diner in a town she didn't know yet, drinking coffee he wasn't tasting, listening to a phone give him information that made him set the coffee down very carefully on the counter and reach for his keys with the measured speed of a man who understood that the next 2 hours were going to require him to do things he was prepared for, and that the woman in the Honda Civic was not going to find a way out of this time. Because this time, Marcus Vane wasn't sending one man to knock on a motel room door. This time, he was coming himself. The diner was called Mel's, which was either the name of someone who'd owned it once or an aspiration toward a type of American roadside authenticity that the place had never quite achieved. It sat at the junction of 2 state highways in the kind of town that existed primarily as a decision point. You were either passing through or you'd made a wrong turn, and its parking lot held 6 vehicles at 9:40 in the morning, none of which were a dark helicopter, and none of which were Harlan Birch's sedan, which was the 2 things Graves checked before he pulled in. He didn't pull in with the full formation. He came in with 3 bikes and Abigail's Honda. The others dispersed to positions Cade had designated in a 2-minute conversation that Abigail had watched from the car with the focused attention of someone learning a language in real time. They took a booth at the back. Maisie sat between Abigail and the wall and ate pancakes with the sustained commitment of a child who had decided that food, when available, was not to be treated casually. The 2 bikers with them, Priest and a quiet, broad man named Wick, who had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and communicated primarily through the precise calibration of his silences, sat across from each other at a table nearby and drank coffee and looked at laptops and did not look like what they were, which was the specific skill set they'd apparently spent years developing. Graves sat across from Abigail. Between them, the folder, a coffee cup, and the particular quality of silence that sits between people who are about to say things they can't unsay. "Tell me about Burke," he said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "What do you need?" "Everything you left out last night because you were tired and scared." She looked at him. He looked back. "I wasn't," she started and then stopped because she had been, and lying about it was a waste of time they didn't have. "Aldrin Burke hired me," she said, 7 years ago. He was the one who fought for my position when the county did a staffing review in 2019. She paused. "He was like a mentor for the first 4 years. And after the first 4 years? After Daniel started saying no to Vane's offers, something changed. Not obviously, just the way Burke looked at me at work. A distance that hadn't been there. I thought it was something I'd done. I spent 6 months thinking it was something I'd done." She turned the cup between her palms. "After Daniel died, he came to the service. He held my hand. He told me Daniel was a good man." Graves said nothing. "He told me Daniel was a good man," she said again, slower. "And then 14 months later I found emails where he's helping Marcus Vane map the timeline for acquiring a property whose owner was going to be dead in 4 days." She stopped, breathed. "He came to the service." The diner produced its ordinary sounds around them. Plates, conversation, The cook's radio from the kitchen doing something country and self-pitying. "He's still in Palmdale," Graves said. "As far as I know. Working at the assessor's office." "He's the chief assessor now," she said. "Got the promotion 8 months after Daniel died." She heard herself say it, and the geometry of it hit her fresh, the way it sometimes did when she put the pieces in that order. Death, gap, promotion. "I don't know if I'd missed that. I might have missed that." Graves picked up his coffee. He didn't drink it. He held it. "We're not just dealing with Vane," he said. "No. Burke's involvement makes this a public corruption case." "Yes, which is why the police that Crenshaw contacted were never going to move on it," Graves said. "Because it doesn't stay at Vane. It goes into the assessor's office. It potentially goes further." He set the cup down. "How high do you think this goes?" She'd been afraid of that question, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was the thing that had been keeping her up in the not-quite-sleep in every cheap motel room for 2 weeks, the shape in the dark that got larger every time she looked at it directly. "Burke doesn't have enough to arrange what happened to Daniel on his own," she said. "He has county connections. He has access to records. He doesn't have the kind of people who make a car accident look like a car accident. Vane has those people. Vane has Birch. Yes." She looked at the folder. "But the emails. There's a third address in 6 of the exchanges. An address I don't recognize. It's a numeric string. Priest flagged it last night when he first looked at the files." She'd given Priest the USB drive in Barstow, one of the 3. She hadn't mentioned that detail to Graves yet. She watched to see if he reacted to the information being distributed without his explicit direction, but he didn't. "He working it?" Graves said, a glance toward the table where Priest was on his laptop. "He's been working it since last night." As if the mention were a summons, Priest appeared at the edge of the booth. He put his laptop on the table, angled so Graves and Abigail could both see the screen. "The numeric address," he said, without preamble, without the setup that would have preceded it in a normal conversation. "It resolves to a private server registered to an LLC in Nevada." He tapped the screen. "The LLC is a subsidiary of a holding company called Meridian Civic Partners." Graves looked at the screen. "Meridian does government contracting," Priest said. "Infrastructure, permitting, project facilitation. They operate in 6 southwestern states: California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, Colorado." He tapped again. "They have contracts with 14 county governments in California alone." Abigail looked at the screen and felt the shape in the dark get very much larger. "Vane isn't the top," she said. "Vane is a developer," Priest said. "He buys land and builds things. Meridian is the thing that makes land available for purchase by making the obstacles to that purchase disappear." He looked at her steadily. "Your husband's property wasn't the first. I've found 4 other transactions in the past 6 years that follow the same pattern. Owner refuses sale. Owner dies. Property transfers through probate at assessed value to a Vane entity or Vane-adjacent entity." A pause. "In 2 of those cases, the county assessor involved received a promotion within 12 months. The diner, the plates, the country radio." Abigail heard all of it from a very long distance. 4 other families," she said, "at minimum. 4 other—" She stopped. Her throat had done something she needed to wait out. "Daniel wasn't—" "No," Priest said. "He wasn't the first." She pressed both hands flat on the table, which was a thing she did when she needed to feel something solid, and the option of walls or floors wasn't conveniently located. Graves was watching her with the expression she'd come to understand as his version of concern. Not performative, not reaching toward her, just present and very still, the way a room is still when something important is happening in it. "The helicopter," she said. "Still inbound," Priest said. "But—" He hesitated, and Priest was not a man who hesitated. The hesitation was its own information. "There's a second vehicle, SUV, 2 men, left Palmdale 40 minutes ago. They're not Birch's people." "Whose people?" Graves said. His voice had dropped a register. "Meridian maintains a private security division," Priest said. "Off the books, basically. Composed of former law enforcement and other things. He looked at Graves in a way that communicated something between the two of them that Abigail didn't have the reference to decode. The two men in that SUV are former federal contractors. How former? Graves said. Current enough that they have access to real-time cell triangulation without a warrant. The booth was quiet. They're tracking my burner, Abigail said. No, Priest said. They're tracking mine. The word landed in the diner with a weight that stopped everything for exactly 3 seconds. Abigail looked at Priest. Priest looked at Graves. Graves looked at Priest with an expression that had gone to a place she'd never seen his face go. A flat, rapid internal assessment. The look of a man running through implications at a speed that precluded the normal processing time. How? Graves said. I don't know yet. And from Priest, who didn't say I don't know, this was its own form of alarm. I noticed it 6 minutes ago. There's a passive tracker on the signal, sophisticated. It's been active since, he checked his screen, since Barstow. Since Barstow, Graves said, since the bank. The bank? The Barstow Bank. The lobby with the efficient staff and the regional branch counter and the woman at the desk who'd processed her safe deposit box request without looking at her particularly hard. Or the parking lot. The parking lot where she'd handed the folder to Graves and the USB drives hadn't left the box, but she'd been standing in a visible parking lot for 7 minutes with the men she was with and their motorcycles, which were not inconspicuous, and Priest's laptop on the motorcycle seat that had been open and running. Did anyone touch your bike in Barstow? Graves said. Priest was already moving. He was out of the diner in 4 seconds, the door's bell hitting its single note behind him. Graves slid out of the booth. He looked at Abigail. Stay here. Don't tell me to... 2 minutes, he said. Maisie stays here. You stay here. 2 minutes. He was gone. Maisie had stopped eating pancakes. She was looking at Abigail with the held breath expression that meant she'd been tracking the conversation and had arrived at an understanding of the situation's severity that Abigail had not explicitly communicated. It's okay, Abigail said. Maisie picked up her fork and went back to the pancakes. Okay, she said. She was 6 years old and she said okay and went back to the pancakes, and Abigail felt something in her chest that was too large and too hot for the moment they were in. Outside, through the diner window, she could see Graves and Priest at Priest's motorcycle. Priest crouched at the rear frame with a flashlight, Wick standing at the lot entrance watching the road. Graves stood over Priest with his arms at his sides, and the rigid stillness of a man exerting significant control over his responses to something. 90 seconds. Priest stood up. He was holding something small between 2 fingers, something that caught the morning light with the flat, non-reflective surface of a piece of electronics designed not to call attention to itself. He held it up. Graves looked at it. They came back inside. Priest set the tracker on the table. It was smaller than a thumbnail. Black composite. She didn't know the maker model, but she knew what it was because she'd looked up trackers during week 1 of running and considered putting one on Marcus Vane's car as a joke she couldn't actually execute. Wheel well, Priest said. Rear right. He looked at it. Military-grade passive. It doesn't transmit until it's queried, which is why I didn't catch it earlier. Someone had to actively ping it. Barstow Bank, Graves said. Or before. Priest turned the device over with 2 fingers. This didn't get placed in Barstow. The placement is too clean. This was placed with access to the vehicle when it was stationary for a significant period. He looked at Graves. Sundowner Inn. The Sundowner Inn. Where Birch had come to the door and then driven north and apparently made a phone call, while Abigail was sleeping and the bikers were in the parking lot with their engines off, while the clerk with the red eyes and the neck tattoo was presumably behind his counter in the lobby where the surveillance camera was. The clerk, Abigail said. The clerk let someone into the parking lot, Priest said, or someone was already in the parking lot. Birch, Graves said. He didn't drive north, he circled. He had 40 minutes while we were still in the parking lot, Priest said. The implication settled. Harlan Birch had come to the door, retreated when the Brotherhood arrived, driven out of sight, placed a tracker on Priest's bike in the dark, while 15 men were occupied with establishing a perimeter at the front of the property, and then driven north for real, because after that he didn't need to follow. After that, he just had to wait. Graves was looking at the tracker. The look on his face was the specific look of a man cataloging a failure of attention in his own operation, which was a look that combined self-assessment and forward calculation in a way that had no interest in wallowing and every interest in correction. "He's good," Graves said. "Better than he should be for private security," Priest said. "His background. I looked at it last night." "And?" "Military intelligence, Signal Corps, 12 years, 6 of them deployed." Priest looked at the tracker. "He didn't learn to do this from Vane." "Meridian," Graves said. "That's where I'd put the money." She understood then that Harlan Birch was not Marcus Vane's man in the way she'd thought. He wasn't a hired enforcer who happened to know how to find people. He was something older and more precise than that, something with training and backing that went beyond a real estate developer's payroll, and the realization restructured everything she'd understood about her situation in a way that felt like the floor of a building dropping one story and finding another floor below it, and having no confidence in that floor either. "He's not working for Vane," she said. "He's working for both," Priest said. "Vane pays him. Meridian directs him." "Which means Vane doesn't fully control what Birch does," she said. "It means Vane is a client," Priest said, "not the principal." The distinction was the size of a continent. Graves looked at Abigail. "The documents in the safe deposit box," he said. "The USB drives." "Yes." "They need to be moved. Now." "I can go." "You're not going anywhere near Barstow," he said. "Cade goes." He was already pulling out his phone. He typed 4 words to Cade. "Barstow. Bank. Now." And added the address. He sent it and put the phone away. His phone rang before he could put it in his pocket. He looked at the screen. His jaw did the thing it did when information arrived that required immediate processing without visible reaction. He answered. "Talk," he said. A pause. He listened for 18 seconds, which she counted because watching his face during those 18 seconds was the only available data source for what was coming. His face didn't change. That was the problem. When Graves's face didn't change, it meant the information was significant enough to require that he make a choice to contain it, and the choice itself was visible even when the information wasn't. He said, "When?" Listened, said, "How many?" Listened, said, "Understood," and ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at Priest. "The SUV isn't 2 men," he said. "It's a convoy, 3 vehicles, 7 men total." He looked at Priest steadily. "And they know about the clubhouse." Priest went very still. "They ran the plates from last night," Graves said. "Motel parking lot. Got 2 clean reads. Cross-reference club registration records." "Our registration is current and clean," Priest said. "Current and clean with an address," Graves said. "The chapter address." A pause. "They have people at the clubhouse. Arrived 20 minutes ago. Nobody's there, but—" He stopped. Abigail watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do. "Tommy," Priest said. The name was flat and certain in his mouth, the way names are when they carry weight. "Tommy's there," Graves said. She didn't know who Tommy was, but she understood from the way Priest had said the name, and from the way Graves was looking at Priest now, that Tommy was someone who mattered in the specific way that certain people matter to damaged men who don't let many people matter to them. The way a last thing matters. "He's 63 years old," Priest said. To Abigail, not to Graves, as if she needed the information to understand the stakes. "He runs the house, cooks, keeps the bikes maintained." A pause. "He's Graves's uncle." Graves was looking at the table, not at the tracker, just at the table, at a point about 2 inches in front of the tracker, with the absolute focused emptiness of a man doing something very deliberate with the space between feeling something and responding to it. "They won't hurt an old man," Abigail said. Graves looked up. "These people," she started. "These people put a tracker on a federal contractor's grade device without detection," Graves said, "in a dark parking lot, in 40 minutes. His voice was even, and it was the most frightening thing she'd heard from him. "They are not Birch at a door at 3 in the morning. They are something different. And I don't know what they want with Tommy except that they went there. and they went there because they know what he is to me. The understanding was cold and complete. Meridian's people weren't trying to stop her. They were building leverage. They had the property, 3 days ago, already done. They had Birch tracking her movements. Now they had a 63-year-old man in a clubhouse they'd found in 20 minutes from a parking lot security camera, and they'd gone there not to make a scene, but to create a condition. A condition where Graves Maddox and his brotherhood had a choice between Abigail Mercer's documents and the man who cooked their meals and maintained their bikes and was old and alone in a building with 7 former federal contractors. They want the USB drives, she said. They want everything, Graves said. Documents, drives, and you. They want the whole thing closed. If they get it all, 4 other families, Priest said, quietly. Not for Graves, for her. She looked at the tracker on the table. She thought about 4 other families who'd had the same geometry applied to them. The property, the refusal, the accident, the transfer, and who had either not found the emails or found them and lost them, or found them and been found, and whose land was now under development or pending or already sold at a profit to someone else up the chain. She thought about Daniel at the fence post. She thought about the half-smile that had known something funny. She thought about Maisie at 6 years old checking under motel room beds for people hiding. "What do you need?" she said to Graves. He looked at her with the flat steadiness that was his version of certainty. "I need you to make a call," he said, "on a clean line, to someone outside this entire network. A journalist, a federal contact, anyone who can receive the files remotely and hold them independently so that even if they take everything physical, the cloud account," she said. He stopped. "I already did it," she said, 14 months ago. 2 weeks ago I updated it with everything I've found since. She held his gaze. "There's a journalist at the Los Angeles Examiner. She covered land acquisition stories for 3 years. I sent her an encrypted package 14 days ago with a time release instruction. If she doesn't receive a specific check-in code from me by," she checked the time, "by 6 p.m. tonight, the package releases automatically to her editorial inbox." The diner was very quiet around them. 14 days ago, Graves said. "I was scared, not stupid," she said. Something moved across Graves Maddox's face that she would not have been able to name precisely, but that she recognized in the way you recognize a language you learned young and thought you'd forgotten. It was relief, but it was relief wearing the complicated clothes of a man who'd spent years not expecting things to work out. Priest made a sound that might have been a short, involuntary version of a laugh. "The problem," she said, "is that it doesn't help Tommy. It doesn't help us in the next," she checked the time again, 8 hours. "No," Graves said, "it doesn't." He stood up. He left money on the table without counting it, which she was starting to understand as a habit, the quick, certain way of handling small transactions that communicated a complete absence of interest in small transactions. "Here's what happens now," he said. He looked at her and at Maisie, who had finished her pancakes and was watching him with her full, undivided attention, Captain held loosely at her side. "Wick takes you and Maisie to a location I'm going to give you. Not a motel, not a public place. A property we use." He said use without elaboration. "You stay there until this is resolved. And you, we go to the clubhouse." 7 men, she said. "I know. They're trained." "I know," he said. "So are we." She looked at him. He looked back. The look that passed between them in that moment was not the look of 2 people who had reached an agreement. It was the look of 2 people who understood that the agreement had already been made somewhere prior to this conversation, in the gravel lot outside the self-storage, or in the Sundowner Inn parking lot at 3 in the morning, or possibly at a dead gas station in the Mojave when a 6-year-old handed him a lucky $2 bill and he put it in the inside pocket of his vest. Maisie stood up from the booth. She reached up and took Abigail's hand. "Mama," she said, "the man's going to be okay." Abigail looked down at her daughter. "The sad one," Maisie clarified, with the patience of someone addressing a reasonable but slow listener. "The one with the tired shoulders." She looked at Graves with the unblinking certainty of someone who had consulted whatever internal resource she used for these assessments and arrived at a firm conclusion. "He's going to be okay." Graves looked at the child for a long moment. His right hand moved to the inside pocket of his vest in the reflexive gesture she'd noticed before, the one he did without seeming to know he was doing it. "Let's hope you're right," he said. He walked out of the diner. Through the window, she watched him mount his bike, watched Priest follow, watched two others she hadn't been introduced to pull out of their positions at the lot edges and form up. Wick appeared beside her with the key to a truck that had apparently been in the diner parking lot the whole time and that she hadn't identified as part of the group. "We go now," he said. "Leave your car here." "My car has 2 more trackers on it," he said, not unkindly. "Probably. We'll deal with it later." She looked at the Honda, the car she'd bought 3 years ago when Daniel said they needed something reliable. The car she'd loaded with 60 pounds of their life at 2 in the morning and driven out of Palmdale with Maisie asleep in the back seat. "Okay," she said. She took Maisie's hand. They went to the truck. Behind them, on the diner table, Priest's tracker sat where he'd left it, because there was no point taking it and no point destroying it, because Meridian's people already knew exactly where they were and exactly where they were going, and the only remaining question was whether Graves Maddox could reach Tommy before the men holding him decided that Tommy's usefulness as leverage had reached its end. The Desert Iron Riders chapter house was a converted machine shop on the eastern edge of Palmdale, a building that had spent 30 years making agricultural equipment parts before the company that owned it moved operations to Mexico and left behind a structure too large to be residential and too specific to be easily repurposed for anything that didn't involve heavy things being done to other heavy things. The Brotherhood had leased it 11 years ago and done nothing to make it look like less of what it was, which was a strategy rather than an aesthetic choice. Buildings that looked industrial got left alone. Buildings that tried to look welcoming invited attention. Graves pulled up 6 blocks south and killed the engine. Behind him, 4 bikes went quiet in sequence. The sudden silence on the empty industrial street was the particular silence of things about to happen. He looked at the chapter house from 6 blocks. He could see 2 vehicles parked at different angles in the lot that bordered the building, SUVs, dark, positioned at angles that covered the 2 accessible sides of the structure without obviously looking like they were covering anything. Civilian positioning. Or close enough. He could not see Tommy. Cade pulled up alongside him. "2 on the lot," Cade said. "I count at least 1 at the back from the S8 view. Priest's working on interior thermal, but the building's metal framed, so—" "Don't need thermal," Graves said. "I need Tommy." "He called you?" "No." That was the detail that mattered. Tommy called every morning at 8:45, which was a habit so consistent that the Brotherhood had started setting informal clocks by it. It was 9:53. "He hasn't called." Cade was quiet for a moment. "He might just—" "He hasn't missed a call in 4 years," Graves said. Cade absorbed this. Let it be what it was. "What's your read?" Cade said. "On Meridian's people." "They're not here to burn the place down," Graves said. "That creates exposure. They want it quiet. They want to use Tommy to get the drives, and the woman, wrap everything into a box, and have it disappear the way the other 4 disappeared." He looked at the chapter house. "Tommy's alive. That's the only thing they have." "Until it isn't," Cade said. "Until it isn't," Graves agreed. He reached inside his vest. The $2 bill. He held it for 3 seconds. Not for luck, not for comfort, for something he didn't have a name for, the specific act of touching something that reminded him that he'd made a decision when a 6-year-old pressed it into his hand, and that the decision was still the right one, and that the right thing to do with right decisions was to finish them. He put the bill back. "Here's what we do," he said. The plan was not complicated. Complicated plans failed at the points of complication. What Graves had learned across 2 deployments, 11 years of riding, and several situations he didn't discuss, was that simplicity was the only thing that held under pressure. You pushed, you covered the exit, you did not stop moving until the thing was done. He went in through the front. He went in alone, on foot, without the others visible, because 7 men holding a 63-year-old cook hostage in a machine shop had agreed to wait for Leverage to arrive, and Leverage arriving as a single man on foot was different from Leverage arriving as 4 motorcycles, and different was an opportunity. He crossed 3 blocks of empty industrial street at a walk, not a run, because running changed posture, and posture communicated intent before you were close enough for intent to matter. He kept his hands visible and his face neutral and his attention on the two visible SUVs. At the lot edge, a man in a dark jacket stepped out of the shadow between the vehicles. He was about 6 feet, wide through the shoulders, with the haircut and posture that said federal background as clearly as a business card. He had his hands loose at his sides and his jacket open, and the jacket being open was information. "Private property," the man said. "My property," Graves said. He stopped 10 feet away. "I'm the leaseholder." The man looked at him with the specific assessment that training produced. Quick, systematic, categorizing, rather than personalizing. "Mr. Maddox." "You know who I am," Graves said. "That tells me your employer did some research before sending you here. That tells me this wasn't spontaneous. That tells me someone's been planning this for longer than this morning." He held the man's gaze. "How long have you been watching us?" "Sir, I need you to—" "How long?" A pause. The man's jaw moved slightly, adjusting to something. "We should go inside," he said. "We should," Graves agreed. They went inside. The chapter house interior was exactly as Graves had left it 48 hours ago. The long central space with the workbenches along the walls, the kitchen area Tommy had built from salvage wood, and 2 commercial refrigerators, the long table made from a door laid across sawhorses where they ate and argued and played cards, the photographs along the east wall, the smell of oil and coffee, and the specific mustiness of a space that was lived in by people who lived hard and didn't prioritize ventilation. Tommy was at the table. He was sitting with both hands on the surface, a coffee cup in front of him, and he was looking at Graves with the particular expression of a man who has been told to stay calm and is staying calm through a quality of personal stubbornness rather than because he finds the situation acceptable. He was 63 and compact, with the permanent lean of someone who'd been doing physical work since adolescence. Gray hair cropped close, a face that had been handsome once and had become something better than handsome with age. He had a bruise forming below his left eye. Graves looked at the bruise. He looked at the man who had walked him inside. "That wasn't necessary," Graves said, very quiet. "He resisted initial contact," the man said. "His name is Tommy Maddox," Graves said. "He's 63 years old. He maintains motorcycles and cooks breakfast." "Graves." Tommy's voice was even, warning him, telling him without elaboration that the geography of the situation required patience rather than the response his face was currently advertising. Graves looked at his uncle. He breathed. He looked at the room. 6 men distributed through it, not Tommy's jacket man. 6 additional, positioned at the workbenches and near the back exit and near the kitchen, all with the same haircut and posture variation, all with the same jacket-open configuration. 7 total, as Priest had said. They were not holding weapons visibly, which was the specific statement that came after weapons had already been established as present. At the far end of the table, standing rather than sitting, was a man who was different from the others in the way that a principal is different from contractors. He was 50 or near it, with a lean, angular face that had the quality of something precisely maintained, silver at the temples, wearing a jacket that cost more than the others' jackets in a way that was just barely visible if you knew what to look at. He had a phone on the table in front of him, a laptop to its left. "Mr. Maddox," he said, "my name is Harold. I represent Meridian Civic Partners." "I know who you represent," Graves said. Harold looked at him with something that wanted to be mistaken for patience, but was actually the face of a man who had decided on an outcome and was managing the process of arriving there. "Then you understand this conversation can be brief." "Tell me what brief looks like to you," Graves said. "The digital files," Harold said. "The documents currently held in a Barstow safe deposit box. The cloud account the Mercer woman referenced to you this morning." He paused. "And Mrs. Mercer herself." "The morning. The diner." He'd referenced the cloud account in a diner, and he hadn't swept for listening devices because it was a public diner at 9:40 in the morning, and he'd been operating on less sleep than he needed, and with the particular tunnel vision that develops when you're managing 7 men and a woman and a child in a tracker in a parking lot. "You had a device in the diner," Graves said. "We had a device on the tracker," Harold said. Auditory range on those is approximately 20 meters. 20 meters. Their booth had been at the back, 20 meters from the front window where the tracker had eventually been placed, not in the parking lot, but closer, while Priest was still running the signal analysis inside. The geometry of it was clean and ugly. The cloud account releases automatically, Graves said. At 6 p.m., Harrell said. We know. We have until 6 p.m. He looked at Graves with the flat certainty of a man who had run this particular type of calculation before and found it manageable. It's 10:04 a.m. You need the account credentials. We need Mrs. Mercer to cancel the release. He paused. Voluntarily. Graves looked at him. And then this is over, Harrell said. Your organization continues? Mr. Maddox continues. A look toward Tommy that was precise in its implications without being specific. Mrs. Mercer will be managed through legal channels. There are a number of outstanding civil matters that could result in extended litigation. Not harm. Litigation. He said it with the tone of a man offering an upgrade. The child is not a consideration. Managed through legal channels. He understood what that meant. Not prison, not violence, but the slow machinery of Meridian's network applied to a woman without resources. The civil liens and the professional destruction and the isolation from institutions that had already proven willing to look away, applied over years until the fight left her the way fights leave people when the cost of continuing becomes more than the cost of stopping. Not harm, just the rest of her life taken one piece at a time. No, Graves said. Harrell looked at him without surprise. He'd apparently expected that answer, which meant he'd moved past it in his preparation before the conversation started. Mr. Maddox, he said. He opened the laptop. He turned it to face Graves across the table length. On the screen, a photograph. It took Graves 3 seconds to understand what he was looking at, and those 3 seconds were the longest 3 seconds that had happened to him since the phone call he'd received 48 hours after an accident in a California canyon 14 months ago. The photograph was of a cemetery, a specific section of a cemetery. 2 headstones. Claire Maddox, age 31. Emma Maddox, age 5. His wife, his daughter. He did not move. The graves are maintained through a county contract, Harrell said. Perpetual care, as specified in the original interment agreement. A pause that had been timed. Contract maintenance can be subject to administrative review. Graves looked at the photograph. He understood that this was the specific shape of what Meridian did. Not violence for its own sake. Leverage, always leverage. The precise application of pressure to the thing a person could not protect by conventional means. They had found, in 11 years of his daughter being dead and his wife being dead, a way to threaten them. He didn't entirely understand the mechanism, whether it was the maintenance contract or the cemetery records or something more involved, and the not understanding was part of the pressure. You don't fight what you can't fully see. That, Tommy said from the end of the table, his voice carrying the specific quality of a man who has decided to stop staying calm, is enough. Everyone looked at Tommy. Tommy stood up from the table. He was 63 and 5'9", and he stood up from the table with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had spent his whole life in rooms with dangerous men and had never once found it useful to perform fear. Boy, he said to Graves. Not disrespectfully, the specific address of a man who had known you since you were 4 years old and was using it now to cut through everything else. Don't you look at that picture anymore. Graves looked at his uncle. Look at me, Tommy said. Graves looked at him. Remember what you told me, Tommy said, 3 years ago, when you came back. 3 years ago, he'd come back from the canyon where Claire and Emma had died, and he'd sat in this building at this table, and he hadn't spoken for 4 days. And on the 5th day, Tommy had put a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. And what Graves had finally said, after the 4 days and the silence and the coffee, was, I don't know how to keep going. And Tommy had said, you keep going the same way you did before. One thing at a time. You don't have to know what comes after the next thing. Just do the next thing. One thing at a time. The next thing. Yeah, Graves said. He looked at Harrell. You're going to close that laptop, he said. Harold's expression shifted slightly. The first micro-adjustment he'd made in the conversation, a small recalibration happening behind his eyes. "Mr. Maddox!" The sound started before Harold finished the sentence. From outside, 3 blocks south, then 2, then 1, the sound of Harley engines. Not 1, not 4. More than that, building from the south and the east simultaneously, the particular layered frequency that 14 motorcycles at speed produce when they're converging on a point. Cade. He'd given Cade 7 minutes after he went inside. 7 minutes to assess through whatever external observation was available, and if Graves hadn't come back out with Tommy, to bring everyone in. It was 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Harold's phone lit up. He looked at it. His expression completed its recalibration. "You have 7 men," Graves said. "I have 14 outside, and I'm 1 in here. Those are not the numbers you planned for." "We can escalate," Harold started. "You can," Graves said. "Escalating means noise. Noise means exposure. Exposure is the one thing Meridian's entire operation is designed to prevent." He held the man's gaze. "Or you can walk out of this building, get in your vehicles, and drive away from a situation that is not going to resolve the way your organization needs it to resolve, because the woman you're looking for has already made sure that the 6 p.m. release happens, whether she cancels it or not." Harold looked at him. "She lied to me," Graves said, "about the cancel code. There is no cancel code. The package releases at 6 p.m. regardless. She built it that way because she spent 14 months learning that everything she did to stop Marcus Vane got used against her, and she decided the only way to make the information safe was to make it impossible to recall." The room was very quiet except for the engine sound outside, which had stopped arriving and was now simply present, a perimeter of sound wrapped around the building. Harold was looking at Graves with the expression of someone recalculating a position that has changed significantly from its projected parameters. "If the package releases," Harold said, "your organization is a motorcycle club," Graves said. "We fix bikes and ride roads and occasionally help people who need help. There's nothing in those documents that touches us." A pause. "There's a lot that touches Meridian Civic Partners, Cascade Ridge Development Partners, the Palmdale County Assessor's Office, a detective named Crenshaw, and Marcus Vane." He let the silence hold. "And there are 4 other families who lost property and people and deserve to know why." Harold's jaw moved. He closed the laptop. The closing of the laptop was the first thing he'd done that hadn't been planned before he arrived. "You're making a significant error," Harold said. "I've made them before," Graves said. "I'm still here." 2 of Harold's men looked at each other with the quick communicative glance of people checking whether the principal has made a decision they need to align to. The man who'd walked Graves in from the lot was looking at his phone with the expression of someone receiving information that confirmed the exterior situation was not recoverable. Harold looked at Tommy. Tommy met the look with the tranquil, absolute patience of someone who has been in the room long enough to know how the room ends. "Escort him out," Graves said to no one in particular, or everyone in general. Nobody moved for 3 seconds. Then Harold picked up his phone. He picked up the laptop. He straightened his jacket in the precise way of a man reassembling his composure around a decision he'd made and was now executing without acknowledgement that the decision had been forced. He walked toward the front of the building. His men followed in the particular organized withdrawal of people who'd practiced leaving situations that had gone wrong without communicating that the situation had gone wrong. The last one out was the man with the jacket-open posture who'd walked Graves in from the lot. He stopped in the doorway and looked back. Graves looked at him. The man looked at the bruise on Tommy's face, then at Graves. Something passed across his face that was either conscience or professional acknowledgement that the bruise had been an error, and in this context, Graves was not certain the distinction between those 2 things was meaningful. The man walked out. The door closed. Tommy sat back down. He picked up his coffee cup and found it cold and looked at it with the expression he used for small disappointments and set it back down. "You didn't eat," he said to Graves. "I can tell." "Tommy, there's food in the kitchen." He got up from the table and moved toward the kitchen with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone resuming an interrupted task. "Sit down." Graves stood in the center of the chapter house and looked at the east wall. The photographs, the years of them, faces he knew and faces he'd known. The specific visual history of a group of men who'd found in each other the closest thing available to the thing they'd each lost before they arrived. He heard Cade's bike come into the lot. Then others, one by one, the familiar individual signatures of each engine that he could identify the way you identify voices. His right hand moved to his inside pocket. He pressed the $2 bill flat against his chest through the leather. He thought about Abigail in a truck with Wick, somewhere north of here, watching her phone. He thought about Maisie with her one-eared rabbit. He thought about the 6 p.m. release and what it would put in motion. Not just Vane, not just Burke, not just Meridian, but the 4 other families and the documentation and the public exposure of something that had been operating in the dark for years, on the assumption that no one would find the seam and pull on it until the whole thing came apart. Abigail Mercer had found the seam 14 months ago. She'd been pulling on it ever since. And the thing she'd built, the cloud account, the journalist, the 14-day timer, was not the work of someone who'd panicked. It was the work of someone who'd understood from the beginning that the system would fail her and had built something outside the system to compensate. He should have trusted that faster. The front door opened and Cade came in, followed by 3 of the others, faces reading the room, reading him, reading the back of Tommy's head visible through the kitchen pass-through. "Tommy okay?" Cade said. "He's making food," Graves said. Cade nodded, looked at the closed laptop shape on the table where Harold had been standing, the slight displacement of the tabletop items that indicated where 7 men had been positioned. He read the room the way he always read rooms, efficiently, without editorial. "They're gone?" he said. "For now," Graves said. Cade looked at him. "For now." "Harold's not done," Graves said. "He's recalibrating. When he reports back to his principal and the principal sees the 6 p.m. timeline and understands the cancel code doesn't exist, they come back harder," Cade said. "Or they cut losses," Graves said. "That's the calculation they'll run. Is the exposure of going harder worth the exposure the documents create?" He looked at the kitchen. "They've been running this operation for 6 years and nobody has gotten to the point Abigail's gotten to. They're not used to the math working against them." "So we're in a holding pattern until 6, Cade said. "We're in a holding pattern until 6, Graves said. "After that, the documents are public and Meridian's leverage disappears." "And Vane's the smaller problem," Graves said. "Vane's the face, Meridian's the structure." He looked at Cade. "The journalist is at the Examiner. Once the package drops, she'll run it. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but she'll run it. And when she does, 4 families, Cade said. 4 families, Graves said. The kitchen produced sounds, the specific, domestic, completely incongruous sounds of a 63-year-old man making food in the middle of a situation that had involved 7 armed contractors and a bruise forming below his left eye and a photograph of 2 headstones used as a threat. Graves's phone rang. He looked at the screen. "Wick." He answered. "Talk," he said. Wick said 4 words. 4 short, flat words delivered in the voice of a man who did not dramatize information because the information was dramatic enough without his assistance. Birch found the truck. The holding pattern that had just been established in Graves's mind, the careful geometry of time and exposure, and a 6 p.m. release that would change the equation, collapsed into a single, immediate, crushing point of focus. Abigail. Maisie. The truck. Wick, who was capable and certain, but was one man. He was moving toward the door before Wick finished the sentence. "Location," he said. Wick gave it. A 2-lane road 17 miles north, a pullout near a dry creek crossing. The truck visible from the road. Birch's vehicle already there, already stopped, already at the point of contact. "How long?" Graves said. "I had 2 minutes when I called you," Wick said. "Hold on," Graves said. "Hold on, Wick. 2 minutes." He hit the door at a run. Behind him, Cade was already on his feet with the movement of a man who'd heard enough from Graves's half of the call to understand what 2 minutes meant. And the kitchen sounds from Tommy's direction had stopped, because Tommy, who had been in this brotherhood longer than most of them, understood the acoustics of urgency as well as anyone in the room. The lot. The bikes. 14 men in various states of having just dismounted or still sitting, looking at Graves coming through the door at the specific speed that meant this was not debrief and not discussion. "Mount up," Graves said. Engines started. The sound of them in the chapter house lot was the sound of an answer being given. Not to Harrell, not to Meridian, not to Marcus Vane, but to the specific question that every one of these men had been asked at some point in their lives, and had answered in the way that had led them here. When it matters, when there is no institutional structure holding the line, when the people in danger are simply people in danger, and the only thing standing between them and the consequence of being unprotected is your willingness to stand there, what do you do? The engines were the answer. Graves mounted his bike, and the throttle under his hand was familiar in the way that only the things you've used to keep yourself alive over many years become familiar, and he pulled out of the lot onto the industrial street, and the formation assembled behind him with the speed of long practice, and the particular resolution of men who have decided that the cost of stopping is higher than the cost of going, and the road north opened in front of him under the Mojave sky, flat and straight and merciless. And 17 miles ahead of him, Wick was holding a line with one man between Harlan Birch and a woman who had been running for 2 weeks and a 6-year-old girl who had assessed the situation and concluded, with the uncluttered certainty of someone not yet old enough to know why certainty was supposed to be complicated, that the man with the tired shoulders was going to be okay. And Graves Maddox was 17 miles away, going as fast as the road would let him go. And the distance was closing, and Birch was already at the truck, and the 2 minutes Wick had when he called were already gone. The Dry Creek crossing on Route 138 was not a place designed for confrontation. It was a pullout of cracked asphalt barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, bordered on one side by a concrete drainage culvert and on the other by a rusted guardrail beyond which the land dropped 6 feet into a wash of white rock and dead brush. The road was 2 lanes and empty in both directions. A single utility pole stood at the near edge of the pullout, its transformer box humming at a frequency you felt in your back teeth before you heard it with your ears. Wick's truck was there. Birch's sedan was angled across its nose, blocking forward movement with the practiced positioning of someone who understood vehicle dynamics as a form of language. Wick was outside the truck, standing between it and the sedan, and the specific arrangement of his body communicated that he had placed himself there deliberately and had not moved from that position despite whatever had been said to him in the elapsed 2 minutes since his call. Birch was 6 feet from him. Between them, in the geometry of the confrontation, not behind Wick, not retreating toward the truck, but standing at Wick's left shoulder with her hand back and down and Maisie's wrist held in her fingers, was Abigail. She had not retreated. Graves registered this in the 2 seconds between seeing the pullout and reaching it, the formation breaking around him as bikes went to both sides of the road and onto the gravel verge, and he was off his bike before it fully stopped moving, boot heels hitting the asphalt with the impact of a man who has been holding 17 miles of controlled urgency in his chest and is now at the place where it can be put down. Birch heard the bikes. He didn't turn immediately. He was a man who'd trained himself not to react to sound before he'd processed its implications, which was either discipline or arrogance, and in this moment it was working against him because the implication of the sound was 14 motorcycles, and it required a full 1.5 seconds for that implication to complete its passage through his assessment and reach his face. By the time his face showed it, Graves was already 15 feet away. Birch turned. He had not drawn his weapon. This was a calculation, not a scruple. Drawing in front of this many witnesses on a public road was a different category of problem than whatever he'd intended at the pullout with 1 man and a woman and a child on an empty 2-lane highway, and his face showed that he was rapidly repricing his options. He looked at Graves. Graves looked at the space between Birch and Abigail, which was 6 feet of California morning air and the entire accumulated weight of what had happened since a dead gas station in the Mojave, and he walked through it until he was standing in it. "Step back," Graves said. Birch looked at him. Then at the bikes, the men, the formation arranged along the road verge with the complete absence of theater. That was the thing about them that was genuinely frightening to people who expected theater. They weren't performing. They were simply there, and being simply there was enough. Birch stepped back. It was not a retreat that looked like a retreat. It was a man adjusting his position based on a new assessment of operational parameters, which was the specific grammar of someone who needed to believe, even in surrender, that he was still making choices rather than having choices made for him. "It's over, Birch," Graves said. "It's not," Birch started. "Harold pulled out of Palmdale 40 minutes ago," Graves said. "His vehicles are on the 14 going north. Meridian made a decision." He held the man's gaze. "They made the calculation you should have made before you drove up here." Birch was quiet. 6 p.m., Graves said. "You know what that means." Something shifted in Birch's face that was not quite the shift of a man giving up, but was the shift of a man accepting a timeline he'd already known was running and had been trying to stop and had just received confirmation he could not stop. The shift of someone who has been in a race they knew they were losing and has now crossed the point where losing is no longer theoretical. He looked at Abigail. She looked back at him. She had, in the 2 minutes before the bikes arrived, done something that Graves would not fully understand until she described it later. She had stepped out of the truck and positioned herself at Wick's shoulder because the alternative, sitting in the truck while Wick stood alone between her and the problem, had simply been unacceptable to her. Not brave, she would say later. Just what made sense when you were done running. "You could have stopped," she said to Birch. Not angry, flat and precise and tired in the way that exhaustion produces a kind of clarity, the noise burned off, and what remains is the true shape of things. A year ago, 8 months ago, any point where you could have looked at what you were helping facilitate and decided it was enough. Birch said nothing. "Were you there?" she said. "When Daniel's car went off the road. Were you there, or did you just make a call?" The road was quiet. "I want you to answer that," she said. Birch looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, and would spend time afterward trying to— It wasn't guilt, not exactly, wasn't the performance of guilt, was something older and more compressed than guilt, something that had been living behind his eyes long enough to have become part of the landscape rather than a weather event. "I made a call," he said. She breathed. Just once, long and slow, the way you breathe when something you needed to know but were afraid to know has been confirmed, and you find that knowing it is both worse and better than not knowing it. "Get in your car," she said. "Drive away. When the package drops at 6, your name is in the documents. You can do with that what you're going to do." Birch looked at her for another moment. He looked at Graves. He looked, briefly and without expression, at Maisie, who was standing at Abigail's left side holding Captain against her chest and looking at Birch with the clear, unblinking assessment she gave to things she was cataloging rather than judging. He got in his car. He drove south. The road ate him in 40 seconds, and then the pullout was just a pullout again. Cracked asphalt, humming transformer, the dry wash below the guardrail full of white rock and dead brush, and the ordinary California desert morning doing what it did, which was continue. Graves stood in the road and watched the sedan until he couldn't see it anymore. Behind him, the bikes were going quiet, one by one, boots on gravel, the creak of leather in the cooling air. He turned around. Abigail was looking at him. Her hand had released Maisie's wrist, and Maisie was now standing on her own, still holding Captain, watching Graves with the focused attention she brought to moments she'd decided were significant. "He admitted it," Abigail said. "Yes." "That's not—" She stopped. "That's not evidence. That's a man in a road pullout saying 2 words. "I know," Graves said, "but you needed to hear it." She looked at him. Something in her face was doing the thing that faces do when they've been held in a particular configuration for a very long time and are beginning carefully to relax from it. Not relief exactly, because relief implies the danger is categorically over, and she understood it wasn't, but something prior to relief, the first loosening. "I needed to hear it," she said. "Yeah." She looked at the empty road where Birch's car had been. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we drive to a place where there's food and you and Maisie can sleep without listening to the parking lot," he said. "And at 6 p.m. the package drops. And after that—" He paused. "After that is tomorrow's problem." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he hadn't seen her do in any of the 20-some hours he'd known her. She laughed. Not a large laugh. Not a released, cathartic laugh. A small, dry, entirely genuine laugh at the specific absurdity of after. That is tomorrow's problem, as the summary of everything they'd been through since the Mojave. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They drove. The location Graves had referenced, the property we use offered without elaboration at the diner, turned out to be a low, wide ranch house 20 miles east of Palmdale, sitting on 2 acres of high desert scrub, owned by a member of the Brotherhood who had retired from riding 3 years ago due to a knee that had finally made its position on continued motorcycle operation abundantly clear. The member's name was Ruiz, and he was at the property when they arrived. A broad, gray-templed man with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the permanent squint of someone who spent significant time outdoors. And he opened the gate and looked at the formation pulling in and at the truck and at the woman and child who got out of the truck, and he said nothing except, "Kitchen's open," and went inside to make it true. The ranch house was not comfortable in the way that hotels are comfortable. It was comfortable in the way that a place is comfortable when it has been genuinely lived in. Worn furniture that had taken the shape of the people who used it. A kitchen that smelled of old coffee and recent cooking. Walls that held photographs and maps, and a mounted set of antlers that predated Ruiz's ownership. There were 3 rooms available. Abigail took the one with a window that looked east toward the mountains, because east was the direction away from Palmdale and the direction away from the road and the direction toward, eventually, morning. She put Maisie on the bed and pulled the covers up and sat on the edge and looked at her daughter's face in the mid-morning light. Maisie was not sleeping. She was looking at the ceiling with the contemplative expression she wore when she was sorting through an experience and organizing it into something she could carry. "Mama?" she said. "Yeah." "Is the bad man going to come back?" Abigail thought about how to answer this with the accuracy it deserved while remaining within the emotional range a 6-year-old could hold. She thought about Birch driving south on the 14, and Harold's vehicles going north, and Meridian recalculating in some office she'd never see, and the documents that would drop at 6 p.m. into a journalist's inbox and begin the long, imperfect institutional process of becoming public record and legal consequence and news story, and eventually, maybe, justice. Not the clean justice of movies, but the complicated, partial, real kind that takes years and leaves things out and still matters. "The bad man is going to have problems of his own," she said, for a long time. Maisie absorbed this. "Because of the emails." "Because of the emails." "That you found." "That I found." Maisie looked at the ceiling. "Daddy would be proud," she said, with the simple factual delivery of someone reporting observable data rather than offering comfort. Abigail's throat did what it had been doing at irregular intervals for 14 months. "Yeah," she said, "he would." Maisie closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes with the total, uncomplicated surrender to sleep that children maintain long past the point when adults lose it. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her and felt the first full morning of not running settle into her body like something physical. A warmth that was also weight, the specific quality of rest that arrives not from absence of danger, but from presence of something you can finally trust to stand between you and it. She went to the kitchen. Ruiz had made eggs. He put a plate in front of her without ceremony and poured coffee and went back to whatever he'd been reading before they arrived. And she sat at the kitchen table in the mid-morning light and ate eggs and drank coffee and looked out the east window at the scrub desert and the mountains beyond it. At 11:43, her phone showed a text from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words. "Package confirmed delivered." The journalist. A check-in protocol she'd established. A confirmation that the package had been received into the right hands and was being held for the 6 p.m. release. She put the phone face down on the table and finished her eggs. At some point, Graves came into the kitchen. He poured coffee and stood at the counter rather than sitting, the chair relationship apparently unresolved, and drank it and looked at the same east window. "Harold's not done," she said. "No," he agreed. "When the documents are public, he'll recalculate again. Meridian will find a new angle." "They'll try," he said. "But trying in public is different from trying in private. What they built required darkness." He held his coffee. "The journalist runs the story. Other journalists pick it up. The 4 other families have names now instead of just property records. There will be investigations, real ones, because the political cost of not investigating will be higher than the political cost of finding something." He paused. "It won't be fast. It won't be clean. But it'll be real," she said. "It'll be real," he said. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I need to find an attorney, a real one, someone who isn't going to get a call from Burke or Vane. Priest already sent 3 names, he said. Civil rights backgrounds, clean records. 2 of them have federal court experience. She looked at him. He was looking at the window with the expression she'd learned, the one that was either patience or the practiced stillness of containment, and she'd become better in the past 24 hours at reading which one she was looking at. This one was patience, something that had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. The $2 bill, she said. He looked at her. Do you still have it? He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and set it on the table between them. It was worn at the folds, soft with age, the kind of object that had been handled often enough to take on the quality of something alive, the warmth and texture of long contact. She looked at it. Her grandfather told her it was lucky, she said, because $2 bills are rare. Because when you find one, you're already the kind of person luck visits. She looked up at Graves. I think he was telling her something about herself, not the bill. Graves looked at the bill on the table. She gave it to a stranger, he said. She gave it to someone she assessed needed it, she said. She's 6, and she assessed you correctly in about 45 seconds. He was quiet for a moment. Emma would have been 8, he said. My daughter. He said it the way you say something you've been carrying in silence for a long time, not performing the weight of it, just setting it down briefly to let the air touch it. She used to do that, assess people. I'd catch her watching someone and I'd ask what she was thinking and she'd say, he stopped, picked up the coffee. She'd say things that were usually right. Abigail held the space around what he'd said with the care it required. Keep the bill, she said. He looked at her. Maisie wanted you to have it, she said. She made that decision. I'm not overruling a decision she made that clearly. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite something else, but was in the vicinity of both, and it changed the landscape of his expression in the way that rare weather changes a landscape, briefly, completely, leaving evidence after it's gone. He put the bill back in his vest. At 5:58 p.m., Abigail was sitting on the ranch house's front step with a second cup of coffee, watching the desert go gold in the late light when her phone showed the automated confirmation. Package released. 6 p.m. She sat with the phone in her hand and the gold desert in front of her and felt 2 years of carrying something at maximum compression begin slowly to decompress, not release, not the dramatic exhale of resolution, but the first incremental loosening of something that had been held at tension so long she'd started to believe the tension was her natural state. Behind her, inside, she could hear Maisie's voice and Ruiz's voice. Maisie apparently having decided that Ruiz was a person of significant interest, and Ruiz apparently having concluded the same about her, the conversation going for 15 minutes at the kitchen table with the sustained collaborative energy of 2 people who have found an unexpected frequency match. She heard boots on the step. Graves sat down beside her, not close, not distant, the pragmatic proximity of 2 people sharing a step. He held out a coffee cup. She already had one. He looked at the 2 cups and set his down on the step to his left. They sat for a while without talking, watching the desert do what the desert did to light in the last hour before dark. The way the rocks changed color, the scrub going from gray-green to bronze, the mountains in the east accumulating shadow from the bottom up. What are you going to do? He said. Not about the investigation, not about Vane or Meridian. What are you going to do, general and specific? The question of a person's life after the emergency has moved to the next phase. She thought about it honestly. I'm going to go back to Palmdale, she said. Not the property. That's in Vane's name right now, and it'll stay there until the legal process says otherwise. But back to the area. Maisie has a school she liked. I had a life there before. She paused. I'm going to build something from what's left. That's not nothing, he said. No, she said. It's not nothing. The desert went another shade toward gold. You don't have to do it alone, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. His profile in the desert light was the profile of a man who had said something precise and meant it, and was now letting it exist without amplification. I know, she said. Not yes. Not a definition of what the not doing it alone looked like, or what it meant, or what the geometry of it was between two people who had met at a dead gas station in the Mojave 30-some hours ago under circumstances that didn't produce ordinary relationship categories. Just, I know. The acknowledgement of something real without the pressure of naming it more than it currently was. He nodded once. Inside, Maisie laughed at something Ruiz said. A full, uncalculated 6-year-old laugh. The kind that has no self-consciousness in it yet. The kind that is pure response to something found genuinely funny. And the sound of it came through the open door and into the gold desert evening and sat there between the two people on the front step like its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked out loud. 3 weeks later, the Los Angeles Examiner ran a front-page investigation under the byline of a journalist named Dara Osei, a 34-year-old who had spent 3 years covering land acquisition stories and had received an encrypted package on a Tuesday evening that had kept her awake for the subsequent 72 hours reading it. The piece named Marcus Vane, Meridian Civic Partners, Aldrin Burke, and a sitting county commissioner. It referenced 5 property transactions. It named 4 families. By the following Monday, the California Attorney General's office had opened a formal investigation. By the end of the month, Aldrin Burke had retained an attorney and declined to comment. Harlan Birch, the Examiner noted in a follow-up piece, had not been located for comment. His employment with Marcus Vane's holding company had been terminated 3 weeks prior to publication. Marcus Vane's attorney issued a statement calling the allegations politically motivated and without factual basis, and Marcus Vane did not appear at the Palmdale development site opening he had been scheduled to attend the following week. And the property that had transferred to Cascade Ridge Development Partners, LLC, was the subject of a title challenge filed by a Palmdale attorney whose offices were recommended by 3 separate sources, all of whom declined to identify themselves. None of this was fast. None of it was clean. But it was real. And real has a different quality than the alternatives. It persists past the moment. It accumulates. It builds toward something even when that something is far ahead and obscured by distance. Abigail found an apartment in Palmdale on the east side, 2 bedrooms, a school 4 blocks away that Maisie walked to on the first day with her backpack and Captain now traveling in the bag rather than the arms. A developmental milestone Abigail noted with the particular parental mix of pride and the specific sadness of watching necessary growth happen. The apartment had a small concrete patio facing east. On the first morning she sat on it with coffee, she looked at the mountains and thought about Daniel at the fence post with his hand on the wood and his half-smile, and she held the thought without the layer of grief that had been sitting over it for 14 months, or not without it exactly, but with more room around it. Grief, and the thing you carry forward existing together in the same space instead of the grief crowding everything else out. On a Saturday in October, 6 weeks after the Examiner piece ran, Maisie was in the apartment's small backyard attempting to teach Captain a series of gymnastic maneuvers that Captain's stuffed body made difficult to execute convincingly when Abigail heard engines on the street. Not one, several. She went to the front of the apartment and opened the door. 6 motorcycles were parked along the curb. Not all 15. 6, a number that felt considered rather than arbitrary, enough to be presence without being event, enough to be visible without being a statement. Graves was off his bike. He was holding something small, a package, brown paper, tied with twine, the kind of wrapping that communicated content rather than presentation. He walked up the path. She stood in the door. "You didn't call," she said. "No," he said. "You could have called." "I could have," he agreed. She stood aside. He came in, and behind her through the apartment she could hear Maisie's voice from the backyard cease mid-sentence, the particular silence that indicated her daughter had looked up and registered something requiring immediate reassessment. Then, Graves. Not a question, not a greeting as much as an identification, the tone of someone confirming a hypothesis. He went through the apartment to the back door and crouched down at Maisie's level and held out the package. Maisie took it with the careful hands she used for things she'd decided were important and untied the twine with focused patience and opened the brown paper. Inside was a small leather jacket, child-sized, soft leather, carefully made, with a rabbit stitched on the back in pale gray thread, Not a club patch, not a symbol, just a rabbit, ears up, mid-stride, going somewhere. Maisie looked at it for a long time. She looked up at Graves. "It's Captain," she said. "Yeah," he said. She held the jacket against her chest the way she held Captain. Not because it was a stuffed animal, but because the thing it represented required that particular form of physical contact, the pressing close of something you want to make sure you're actually holding. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. He straightened up. He looked at Abigail, who was standing in the back doorway with her coffee and the October morning behind her and the quiet, particular expression of someone watching something that is happening in exactly the right way, which is to say, simply and without performance, and at the scale of what it actually is, rather than what it could be made to seem. "Coffee," she said. "Yeah," he said. They went inside. On the street, the 5 remaining bikes waited with their engines off and their riders sitting or standing in the particular unhurried way of men who had no place they needed to be right now, except where they were. And the October morning was cool and bright, and the street was quiet, and the mountains to the east were doing what mountains did in clear California. Autumn light, which was to be very large and very still, and to communicate, without trying, that whatever happened in the foreground happened in front of something that had been there longer and would be there after, and that this was not a diminishment of the foreground but a kind of permission. The permission that scale gives to small things, to be exactly what they are, exactly as much as they are, without needing to be more. Inside the coffee was hot, outside the engines were quiet, and somewhere on the desk in the east-facing apartment bedroom, a worn $2 bill that had traveled from a grandfather's hand to a 6-year-old's pocket to a biker's vest sat in an envelope Graves had left on the table with a note that said, in handwriting that was precise and a little cramped, the way the handwriting of people who learn to write in the field sometimes is, for Maisie, from her grandfather through her to me and back. Keep the luck in the family. She had read it twice and put it in the desk drawer and closed the drawer and stood in the quiet apartment with the October morning coming through the east window and felt, for the first time in 14 months, the specific sensation of being somewhere rather than running from somewhere, which are different orientations toward the same geography and produce entirely different experiences of being alive in it. The coffee cooled. She poured 2 cups anyway.